The barn was going to kill someone. Mason Reed stood in the snow-covered field staring up at the massive structure and felt it in his chest the way he always did. That low, cold certainty that arrives before the words do. 40 feet of rotting timber and crumbling stone, groaning under 3 feet of ice like an old man losing a fight. He'd already decided to quit. The woman standing beside him was worth $200 million. She was about to lose everything. And Mason, the man she'd hired to save it, was 30 seconds away from telling her it was already too late. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The drive into Blackwood Ridge took Mason Reed 2 hours longer than it should have, not because of the distance. The Whitmore estate sat 40 miles northeast of the city, a straight shot up Route 9 through pine corridors and frozen farmland that Mason could have done in his sleep. He'd made that drive 100 times over the years, hauling equipment to job sites scattered across the valley. Renovations, restorations, emergency structural work for people who'd let their properties go too long without attention. He knew that road. What he didn't know was the ice. It had come down the night before in that particular way that February storms sometimes pulled off in this part of the state. Not dramatic, not howling, just relentless. A quiet, patient coating that turned every surface into something that wanted to put you in a ditch. Mason's truck, a 2014 Ford F250 with a cracked side mirror and 190,000 miles on the odometer, had rear tires that were 2 seasons overdue for replacement. He'd been meaning to get to it. He was always meaning to get to something. He came within about 8 feet of sliding off the road twice. Once near the Miller Creek overpass, once on the long downhill curve past the old grain elevator outside Harwick. Both times he corrected quietly, both hands on the wheel, jaw tight, and kept moving. There was nobody else on the road. The radio was playing something he wasn't listening to. The heater worked on one side. In the passenger seat, his 8-year-old daughter Emma slept with her cheek pressed against the cold window glass, a purple wool hat pulled down over her eyebrows, and her arms wrapped around a stuffed horse she'd owned since she was 3. The horse was missing one eye and had a mane that had been brushed so many times it was more matted felt than hair. Emma called it Captain. Mason glanced at her when he corrected through the second skid. She didn't wake up. He let out a breath and drove. He hadn't planned on bringing her. That was the honest truth, and it sat in the back of his mind the way uncomfortable truths usually did. Present, immovable, demanding occasional acknowledgement. Emma was supposed to be at school. Mason was supposed to drop her at 7:45, make it to the estate by 9, do his walkthrough, deliver his assessment, and be back in the city before dinner. Clean, efficient. The kind of day where everything fit where it was supposed to. Then Emma had woken up with a low fever at 5 a.m. and spent 40 minutes sitting on the bathroom tile looking pale and miserable, and Mason had made the calculation every single parent makes when they've got somewhere to be and a sick kid and no backup. He'd called his neighbor, Mrs. Parrish, who watched Emma sometimes. No answer. He'd called his sister Dana, who lived 20 minutes away and had watched Emma occasionally when he had evening jobs. Dana's husband picked up and said she'd left for a conference in Portland 2 days ago. He'd called the only other person on his list, which was his buddy Jake from the crew, and Jake had laughed in a way that made it clear he was not and had never been equipped for child supervision. So Emma came. She'd sat up in the truck cab wrapped in a blanket with Captain tucked under her arm, declared that she felt mostly fine, just cold, and was asleep before they reached the highway. Mason had driven in silence and thought about the job. The Whitmore job had come to him the way most of his work came these days, through reputation, which was another word for history, which was another word for the trail of things you'd said and done that people remembered long after you'd moved on. His name had gotten to the Whitmore estate through a man named Gerald Foss, a structural engineer Mason had worked with on a historic mill restoration 3 years back. Gerald had apparently recommended him to the estate's property manager with words along the lines of, "He's not the cheapest guy you'll find, but he's the only one who'll tell you the truth even when it costs him the job." Mason had heard that secondhand. He wasn't sure if it was flattering or damning or both. The property manager, a tired-sounding man named Dale Archer, had called him on a Tuesday, explained the situation in the clipped, careful way of someone who had already delivered bad news too many times, and asked if Mason could come out for an assessment. What Archer had told him, The main horse barn on the Whitmore property was a historic structure built in 1887, extensively expanded in the 1940s, and had most recently been partially renovated by the estate in the early 2000s. It had been uninhabited, no horses, no active use for the past 6 years following the death of the estate's owner, one Harold Whitmore. It was now facing a mandatory structural inspection from the county bank that held a lien on the property, scheduled for 30 days out. If the structure failed inspection, the bank had the right to classify the estate as a liability and move toward foreclosure on a substantial portion of the property. What Archer had not told him, but what Mason had pieced together from public records and 2 minutes of research. Harold Whitmore had died with considerably more debt than his public profile suggested. The agricultural empire, the Whitmore name was on grain distribution contracts across 3 states, looked solid from the outside. From the inside, it had been hemorrhaging money for years. His heir, a daughter named Victoria, had inherited something that looked like a fortune and functioned more like a trap. Mason had read enough of the financial picture to understand why the barn mattered so much. It wasn't just a building. It was a line item on a balance sheet that was already bleeding. He'd accepted the assessment job with the standard disclaimer he gave every client. "I'll tell you what I see. I won't tell you what you want to hear." Archer had paused on the phone and said that was exactly what they needed. The Whitmore estate appeared through the tree line at 9:22 in the morning, and Mason's first thought was that it was extraordinary in the way that things are extraordinary when money and time have been poured into them by people who genuinely loved what they were building. The main house was a stone Georgian manor, 3 stories, wide front steps, symmetrical windows across the facade. Even under February snow cover, it had a solidity to it, the kind of bones that held. The grounds were formally laid out, he could tell even with everything buried, with what would be wide gravel drives in other seasons reduced now to packed snow tracks, and hedgerows reduced to white mounds on either side. The driveway was long. Mason drove it slowly, noting the tree damage from what looked like recent storms, a section of stone wall along the east side that had partially collapsed, and the way the property sloped down to the west toward what he guessed was pasture or field. Emma had woken up somewhere during the last mile of the estate road. She sat up, rubbed her eyes under her hat, and pressed her face to the window. "Is that where we're going?" she said. "It's where I'm working," Mason said. "You're staying in the truck. It's really big." "Yeah." "Is that a barn?" He hadn't seen it yet. He followed her line of sight past the main house to the right, where the driveway curved, and yes, there it was. The barn. His stomach dropped about 2 inches. There was no other way to put it. The structure was in worse shape than anything Dale Archer had described over the phone. Mason pulled the truck to a stop in the cleared area near the barn's entrance lane, put it in park, and sat there for a moment just looking at it. He did this sometimes. Let the first impression settle before he started breaking it down into components and assessments and load calculations. Let himself just see it. The barn was massive. That much was immediately clear. Whatever the original 1887 structure had been, the 1940s expansion had made it something considerable, maybe 200 feet long, 40 feet wide, with a gambrel roof that at its peak probably cleared 50 feet. Built from a combination of stone foundation and timber framing, sided with vertical board and batten that had once been painted red and was now a kind of exhausted gray-brown, weathered down to the wood grain in most places. The left side of the structure, the north-facing elevation, had taken what appeared to be sustained punishment from ice and wind over multiple seasons. 3 sections of the roof were visibly compromised, 2 of them with daylight showing through. The north wall had a lean to it that made Mason's chest tighten on instinct. Not a dramatic lean, not a collapse-imminent lean, but enough of one to mean something was happening in the frame below. 2 of the large sliding doors along the west face had separated from their tracks and were being held in approximate position by what appeared to be a chain wrapped around them. One of the cupolas on the roofline had lost its cap entirely and sat open to the sky. The foundation, what he could see of it above the snow, looked like mortared stone, which was appropriate for the period. Age-darkened and in a few spots mossy even in winter. But it wasn't the foundation that was scaring him. It was the roof. "Daddy," Emma said, "are those holes up top?" Yeah, baby. That doesn't look good. No, Mason agreed. It doesn't. Damn. He was still sitting there when someone came out of the barn. He hadn't expected that. Dale Archer had told him to arrive by 9 and that someone would meet him. Mason had assumed someone meant the property manager himself, or maybe a maintenance worker, or possibly no one, and he'd be doing the walkthrough solo. The woman who walked out of the barn's smaller side door, not the main entrance, the personnel door on the south face, was none of those things. She was around 30, he'd learn later. Right now, all he registered was dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that the wind was immediately making impractical, a canvas work coat that was genuinely muddy along the cuffs, heavy work boots with salt stains up the toe caps, and the kind of expression that told you a person had been awake for too long and was running on something other than optimism. She wasn't dressed like a billionaire heiress. She was carrying a crowbar. She stopped when she saw his truck, seemed to orient herself, and walked toward him with the direct, purposeful stride of someone who had somewhere to be and preferred to get there without ceremony. Mason got out of the truck. "Mr. Reed," she said, extending her free hand. Her grip was firm, and her hand was cold. "Victoria Whitmore, thank you for coming." "Miss Whitmore?" He shook her hand. His eyes went back to the barn despite himself. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "I doubt that." She looked at the barn, then back at him. "You're thinking it's worse than Archer described." "I was thinking a few things," Mason said. "That was one of them." Something moved across her face. Not offense, not quite. More like the expression of someone who had steeled themselves for a particular blow and was now waiting to see if it would land where they expected. "How bad?" "I haven't done the walkthrough yet." "But," he looked at the roof line, the 3 open sections, the lean on the north wall, the chain on the doors. "But my first impression isn't good." She nodded once, a single precise movement that told him she'd already known that and had spent time making peace with it before he arrived. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you what we've been looking at." It was only when Mason turned back to the truck to grab his assessment bag that Emma's face appeared in the passenger window, nose pressed against the glass, eyes wide. Victoria Whitmore stopped walking. "You brought someone," she said. "My daughter. She's not feeling well. She was supposed to stay in the truck." "She can come inside," Victoria said immediately. "It's warmer, relatively." Mason hesitated. His default was to keep Emma separate from job sites, not because of her, but because of the way clients sometimes reacted to a contractor who showed up with a kid in tow. Like it said something about his reliability, his focus. "She won't be any trouble," he said, and it came out more defensive than he'd intended. "I didn't think she would be," Victoria said, and her voice had shifted slightly. Some of the business meeting precision had softened. She looked at the truck window where Emma was still pressing her nose flat against the glass in that particular way that made her look like a cartoon. "What's her name?" "Emma." Victoria raised one hand toward the window in a small wave. Emma's eyes went huge and she waved back with both arms like she was flagging down a rescue aircraft. Despite everything, Mason almost smiled. The interior of the barn was, if anything, more alarming than the exterior. Mason walked through it slowly, Emma at his side with her hand in his and Captain tucked under her other arm, while Victoria walked slightly ahead, pointing things out with the crowbar occasionally in a way that suggested she'd been conducting her own informal assessment for days. The barn was divided into 2 main sections by a heavy timber partition wall, a horse stabling area on the north end with 12 stalls, and a larger open area to the south that had been partially converted at some point into what looked like a small indoor arena or workspace. The floors were packed dirt on the north end, poured concrete on the south. The smell was old wood, dust, cold air, and underneath it something Mason always associated with horse barns specifically. That dry hay and animal warmth that lingered even years after the animals were gone. Like the building still remembered. The light was bad. Several of the interior lights were out or missing entirely, and the holes in the roof admitted columns of gray February light that illuminated the dust motes and the problem areas with equal indifference. There were problem areas. Mason moved through the stabling section first, running his hand along the wall framing, pressing his palm against support posts, crouching to look at connections between the original stone foundation walls and the timber framing above. He carried a small flashlight, and a moisture meter, and a notebook. He worked quietly, the way he always worked, not ignoring Victoria, but not performing for her either. She seemed to understand this. She stayed close enough to answer questions when he had them and far enough away to let him think. "When did you last have anyone in here?" he asked. "My property crew did a basic walkthrough about 8 months ago," Victoria said. "Before that, nothing since my father died." "No winterization?" "They did some. Covered the main ventilation openings, added temporary bracing to 2 of the stall partition walls." She pointed to a section of the north wall where 2 lengths of 4x4 lumber had been wedged against the framing at a 45-degree angle. "That was Marcus. He's my head groundskeeper. He was worried about that section." Mason looked at the bracing. He looked at the wall it was supposedly supporting. Did Marcus happen to note why he was worried about that section? "He said the wall had movement." "Movement," Mason repeated. "Is that not the right word?" "The word's fine. The thing it describes is the problem." He pressed his palm flat against the wall. Even through his work glove, he could feel it. Not dramatic movement, but present. A slight flex when he pushed that shouldn't have been there. He looked up, tracing the load path above with his eyes, following the pressure down from roof to rafter to post to plate to foundation. "Tell me what you know about the last roof repair." Victoria moved to stand beside him, looking up at the same rafters. 2003. The entire south half of the roof was reshingled and some rafter repairs were done. The north half was assessed and deemed in acceptable condition. "By who?" "A contractor. I don't have his name." "Any documentation?" "Some. Dale Archer has it." Mason made a note. He stepped back and looked up again, and this time he found what he'd been half looking for. The thing that had been nagging at him since he walked in and started reading the barn's structural language. In old buildings, if you knew how to look, the bones told you the story. Not always the full story, but the beginning of one. The rafters on the north section were doing something they shouldn't have been doing. It wasn't immediately obvious. The kind of deflection he was seeing, a subtle bow in the middle of the rafter span, a slight asymmetry in the way the pairs met at the ridge, was the kind of thing that a non-structural eye might walk past without registering. Even some contractors would have walked past it. But Mason had been reading old timber frames for 15 years. "How long has the north roof been leaking?" he asked. Victoria's expression shifted. "You can tell that from looking at it?" "The leak isn't what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the result of the leak." He pointed up at a darkened section of the rafter near the wall plate connection. "Water infiltration over multiple seasons. That connection is compromised. Probably has been for a while." He moved along the wall, still looking up. "Where it matters is here. These are your primary lateral connections. If they're compromised, the north wall starts losing its triangulated support from above." He turned to look at the north wall, the wall with the lean. "Which would explain—" "The wall moving," Victoria said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "So the roof is causing the wall problem." "Part of it, yeah." "And the foundation?" "The foundation," Mason said, and he chose his next words carefully because he had a specific discipline about never saying things he hadn't verified, "is what I need to look at next." He went along the perimeter of the north wall, crouching every few feet to brush snow and debris away from the base of the foundation stones, pressing his hands into the ground to feel the frost line, checking the mortar joints with a small probe. The stone here was limestone, which was typical for the region and the period. Well laid, originally. The individual stones were still solid. That much was clear. Limestone didn't rot, but mortar did. And more importantly, pressure could move things that were otherwise solid if the pressure was applied in the wrong direction for long enough. Emma had been quiet since they came inside, which was unusual for her. She walked along behind him as he worked the perimeter, and he could feel her eyes moving across everything. The stalls, the old iron hardware on the stall doors, the hay forks still hung on pegs along the wall, as if someone had left them there 60 years ago, meaning to come right back. "Did horses live here?" she asked. "They did," Victoria said. She was walking on Emma's other side. "My father had 12 of them. Thoroughbreds, mostly. He loved them." "Where did they go?" There was a brief silence. "When my father passed away, I had them relocated to a partner farm. I didn't have the capacity to care for them here, and I didn't want them to. I didn't want them standing in a barn that wasn't being properly looked after. Emma considered this with the serious thoroughness she applied to most things. That was good thinking, she decided. Thank you, Victoria said, and her voice had something in it that was different from the tone she'd been using with Mason. Lighter, but also somehow more fragile. Mason was still crouched at the base of the north wall, running his probe through a mortar joint, when Emma crouched down beside him. Daddy, she said. Yeah, baby. Look at that. He looked where she was pointing. There was a section of the stone foundation where the winter snow had drifted against the wall, and then partially melted and refrozen, creating an ice shelf along the base. Emma was pointing at a gap, maybe 2 inches, between the bottom of the timber wall plate and the top of the foundation stone directly below it. Mason went still. He moved his flashlight to the gap. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up, mentally retracing the load path he'd been building in his head for the last 40 minutes. He looked at the gap again. He looked at the roof. He looked at the north wall lean. And something clicked. Tell me, Victoria said from behind them both. She was watching him with her arms crossed, and there was something in her voice that walked the line between impatience and dread. Whatever you're seeing, tell me. Mason stood up slowly. He turned to look at the north wall from a distance, then looked at the roof above it, then looked at the south roof section, the one that had been properly repaired in 2003 and was holding its load correctly. He moved his eyes back to the north section, to the compromised rafters, to the deflection and the asymmetry and what it was doing to the load distribution above the north wall. The foundation isn't failing, he said. Victoria blinked. What? The foundation stones are solid. The mortar is aged, but it's functional. The frost depth is at normal levels for the season. He looked at her. Your foundation isn't dying. Then what is that gap? The wall plate is dropping. He pointed up. The roof load on the north section is being distributed wrong. Those compromised rafter connections I showed you, they're letting the ridge load shift. Instead of distributing weight evenly down through the wall frame to the foundation, you're getting a concentration of load at certain points, and those points are putting a downward and outward force on the wall plate that it wasn't designed to handle. Meaning, Victoria said, meaning the roof is crushing the wall, not from outside, from above. He paused. The wall is separating from the foundation because it's being pressed down and outward. If the rafter connections continue to fail, the load shifts more, the plate drops further, and eventually the north wall loses enough connection with the foundation to collapse, Victoria said flatly. The north section would come down, yes. Probably take a portion of the roof with it. She absorbed this. Her jaw was tight. Outside the barn walls, the wind picked up briefly, and something, a branch or ice, or both, struck the exterior with a sound like a muffled gunshot. Nobody flinched. They were past flinching. But, Emma said. Both adults looked at her. Emma was looking up at her father. She had that particular expression she got sometimes, the one where she was about to say something that she'd already worked out and was waiting for someone else to catch up to. Daddy said the foundation isn't dying. He said the roof is the problem. So if you fix the roof, you stop the load from shifting, Mason said slowly. And then the wall can go back where it's supposed to be, Emma said. It's not quite that simple. But it's the right direction, Emma insisted. Right? Mason looked at the north wall. He looked at the gap at the base. He looked at the rafter connections above. He had come here this morning with a specific expectation. He'd driven 40 miles through ice and brought his sick daughter and carried the quiet professional certainty of a man who has seen a lot of old buildings and knows when they're past saving. He had been ready to tell Victoria Whitmore that her barn was beyond reasonable repair, that the responsible assessment was a controlled demolition of the north section, stabilization of what remained, and a revised scope that would produce something smaller and safer. He'd been ready to say that gently, the way he'd learned to say these things over the years, with enough technical grounding that the person understood it wasn't his opinion, it was engineering. He looked at his 8-year-old daughter, who was looking at him with complete confidence that he was about to agree with her. He looked back at the barn. It's the right direction, he said. They came back out into the snow a little after noon. Mason stood in front of the barn with his notebook, writing quickly. Not an assessment yet, just the raw inventory of what he'd seen. The list was long. He wrote without looking up, and Victoria stood nearby, hands in the pockets of her work coat, looking up at the structure with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I need to be straight with you," Mason said, still writing. "Please." "I said the foundation isn't failing. That's true. What I didn't say is that the rest of this is simple." He stopped writing and looked up. "The rafter connection repairs on the north section are major. We're talking about working at height in winter conditions, which means weather holds and safety constraints that are going to eat time. The wall plate needs to be jacked back and reshimmed before the load path is corrected, which is a precision job you can't rush. The roof," he glanced at the open sections. "The roof holes need temporary weatherproofing immediately, today, before any more precipitation comes in and adds dead load to the compromised rafters. If we get another storm before that's done, the timeline gets a lot harder to meet." 30 days, Victoria said. The inspection is in 30 days. "I know." He closed the notebook. "I'm not going to tell you it's easy. I'm going to tell you it's possible. Those are different things." She looked at him steadily. She had dark eyes and a way of holding your gaze without aggression that was harder to read than aggression would have been. "How many people do you need?" she asked. 4-person crew minimum, more for the roof work. "Can you get them?" "My regular crew is available. 2 of them." He paused. "I'll need to bring in a rigging specialist for the rafter work. I know a guy. And you." "And me," he said. "Will you take the job?" He looked at the barn one more time. He'd had this moment before, the moment before commitment, where everything was still theoretical and the weight of what you were agreeing to was just outside arm's reach. He'd learned to take his time in this moment, not because he was indecisive, but because once he said yes, he meant it completely, and he needed to be sure he knew what he was saying yes to. 30 days. Winter conditions. Compromised rafters. A billionaire with debt she hadn't advertised, and 30 days before a bank inspector arrived to determine if her father's last dream would survive. A foundation that wasn't dying. "I'll take the job," Mason said. Victoria Whitmore let out a breath so controlled it was almost invisible. If he hadn't been watching closely, he would have missed it. The smallest possible expression of relief from a person who had apparently decided a long time ago that the world wouldn't see her fall apart. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Ask me again in 30 days. Emma, who had been sitting on the truck's front bumper eating a granola bar that she'd apparently located in her coat pocket, looked up. "Can I come back?" she asked. Victoria looked at her. Something in her expression did something complicated. "If your father brings you," she said, "you're always welcome here." Emma looked at Mason. Mason looked at the barn. "We'll see," he said. He drove home through the late afternoon with Emma half asleep again beside him, and the notebook on the seat between them, already full of his cramped, precise handwriting. Numbers and materials lists and load calculations that were still forming themselves in the back of his mind. The ice on the road had softened slightly in the afternoon temperature. He drove carefully anyway. He thought about the foundation, the gap between the plate and the stone, the weight coming from above instead of below, a load applied in the wrong direction by a roof that had been quietly failing for years while nobody was looking. He thought about how close he'd come to calling it dead before Emma had crouched down next to him in the cold and pointed at what was actually there. He thought about Victoria Whitmore standing in her own barn with a crowbar and work boots, and the particular expression of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has mostly made their peace with the weight of it. He thought about 30 days. He thought about his crew, the materials, the rigging specialist, the cost projections he'd need to put together before morning. He thought about the way Victoria had said thank you, that controlled, precise delivery that was trying not to show how much it mattered, and the way it had sat with him longer than those 2 words had any particular reason to sit. He turned onto the highway. The radio was playing something he wasn't listening to. The heater still only worked on one side. Emma shifted in her seat and spoke without opening her eyes. "I liked her," she said. "Go to sleep, Emma." "She had good boots." "Emma." A pause, then settling back against Captain. "She seemed sad." Mason drove. He didn't answer that, but he thought about it the rest of the way home. Mason was back at the Whitmore estate by 6:30 the following Monday morning. Not because he had to be. The crew wasn't arriving until 8, The equipment rental truck wasn't scheduled until 8:30, and there was nothing requiring him to stand in a frozen field in the dark, staring at a barn that couldn't see him staring at it. He'd told himself he was coming early to walk the perimeter again before the crew arrived, to re-verify a couple of the load calculations he'd been turning over in his head all weekend, to check the temporary weatherproofing his subcontractor had installed on Friday. All of that was true, and none of it was the whole story. The whole story was that he'd spent the weekend running numbers and material lists, and the job kept pulling his attention in a way that jobs didn't always pull it. Most restoration work, even the complicated kind, had a logic to it that Mason could hold at a distance. You saw it, you assessed it, you planned, you executed. The building was a problem. He was the solution. The gap between those two things was work. This job had a different quality to it. The gap felt less like work and more like something else he didn't have a clean word for yet. He parked where he'd parked before, near the south side of the barn, and got out into air that was cold enough to feel like a physical object. 22 degrees according to his truck thermometer. Clear sky, which meant no immediate precipitation risk, which was the only good news the weather had offered all week. The forecast for Thursday was a system coming in from the northwest that the weather services were describing with the kind of careful language that meant they weren't sure yet whether it would be bad or very bad. He had until Thursday to get the north section emergency stabilized. He pulled on his work gloves and walked the perimeter. The temporary weatherproofing, heavy polyethylene sheeting over the 3 open roof sections, secured with batten strips and construction adhesive, had held through the weekend. That was something. One of the smaller things in the north wall, a section of board siding near the second stall that had lost most of its backing, had shifted slightly in the wind. He made a note. He looked at the foundation gap, the one Emma had spotted, and confirmed what he'd seen Friday. No change, which was both good and meant nothing because the conditions that would cause change weren't a gradual drift. They were a structural event, and structural events didn't announce themselves in advance. He was crouched at the northeast corner, pressing his probe into a mortar joint, when he heard the estate's side door close. He looked up. Victoria Whitmore walked across the frozen ground toward him in the gray pre-sunrise light, wearing the same canvas work coat from Wednesday and carrying 2 mugs. She moved carefully on the ice, not with the exaggerated caution of someone who wasn't comfortable with it, but with the matter-of-fact attention of someone who'd lived through enough winters to know the ground didn't care how important you were when you were on it. She held out a mug when she got close enough. He stood up and took it. Coffee. He registered the warmth against his gloved palm and the smell of it in the cold air and the fact that she had apparently been up before 6:30 on a Monday to bring it out. "I saw your truck," she said. "Didn't mean to wake anyone." "You didn't. I was already up." She wrapped both hands around her own mug and looked up at the barn's north face, which in the pale early light looked simultaneously more damaged and more dignified than it did in full day. "How does it look?" "The weatherproofing held," Mason said. "The rest of it looks the same as it did Friday, which is the best thing I can say." "That's something." "It is." He drank the coffee. It was strong, and he didn't ask about it. "Your crew getting here at 8? Dale arranged everything according to your materials list. The lumber delivery was confirmed for 7:30. She paused. "I need to talk to you about the budget." He looked at her. "I want to be transparent," she said, in the careful voice of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and is now checking whether the rehearsed version is still the right one. "The numbers Dale gave you for the initial scope, those are accurate. What they don't reflect is that I've had to restructure 2 other payment obligations in the past week, and there's a cash flow situation for the first 2 weeks of the project that's—" She stopped. Started again. "I can cover the materials and your crew. I can't cover the rigging specialist for the rafter work in week 1. I need another 10 days before that payment clears." Mason considered this. The rigging specialist, a man named Corso, who he'd worked with twice and trusted completely, was scheduled for day 8. Day 8 was critical because the rafter connections had to be secured before the weatherproofing could be permanent, and the weatherproofing had to be permanent before the wall plate work could begin. If Corso got pushed to day 18, the sequencing of the whole job folded in on itself. "I confront Corso's first week," Mason said. Victoria looked at him. "You can reimburse me when the cash clears," he said. "I've done it before on jobs where the payment timeline didn't match the work timeline. It's not ideal, but it works." Mr. Reed, I'm not asking you to. I know you're not asking. He looked back at the barn. Corso needs to start day 8, or the sequencing breaks down. If the sequencing breaks down, we're not making the 30-day inspection. If we're not making the inspection, I know what happens if we miss the inspection, she said quietly. Then let me front Corso. She was silent for a moment. There was something in the silence that was harder than disagreement. It had the quality of a person who found accepting help more difficult than needing it, which was a specific kind of difficult that Mason recognized because he was the same way. All right, she said finally. Thank you. Don't thank me, it's project management. He finished the coffee and handed back the empty mug. You said you were already up. How early is early? She looked at him for a moment like she was deciding whether to answer honestly. 4:30, she said. You do that often. Since my father died, yeah. I stopped sleeping through the night pretty much completely. She said it without self-pity, in the same tone she might have used to say I stopped drinking milk or I changed my commute, like it was just a fact about her current life that she'd long since accepted. I get a few hours and then I'm up. I've learned to use it. Mason didn't respond to that immediately. He put his probe back in his vest pocket and looked at the northeast corner of the barn, at the mortar joint he'd been examining. My wife died 4 years ago, he said. I didn't sleep through the night for about 18 months after. He hadn't planned to say that. It came out at the same register as her statement, just a fact, offered in the same plain way. Not a bid for sympathy. Not an attempt to match her or comfort her. Just a thing that was true. Victoria looked at him. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't know. No reason you would? He looked at her. Does it get better? The sleeping. He paused. I should tell you that it does, since it did for me. Eventually. Did you have to do anything specific? I got a dog, he said. Didn't cure anything, but having something that needed me at a specific time every morning helped. Got me out of bed before the thinking started. She almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it was close. What happened to the dog? He's at home right now, destroying a rope toy that Emma gave him for his birthday. He picked up his notebook. His name is Tank, and he weighs 11 pounds. This time the almost smile went all the way, just briefly, just enough to change her face completely. Then headlights swept across the frozen ground from the driveway, and the lumber delivery was arriving, and the conversation was over, and the day began. Boom. The crew arrived at 8 on the nose. 2 of them were Mason's regulars, Danny Ruiz and Carl Peterson, who had been working with Mason long enough that they communicated in the compressed shorthand of people who had solved enough problems together to have developed shared vocabulary for all of them. Danny was 26, fast, and laughed at everything, including things that weren't funny, which was either irritating or useful depending on the circumstances. Carl was 43, methodical, and had the particular skill of being able to look at a structural problem for 5 minutes in complete silence and then say exactly the right thing. The 4th person was someone Mason had called Saturday afternoon, a local carpenter named Roy Hadley, who had done barn restoration work for 30 years and knew the specific language of timber frame agricultural buildings in a way that Mason could match technically but not experientially. Roy was 61, heavy-set, and operated on the principle that any problem worth solving was worth solving slowly enough to get it right. Mason laid out the first week's plan on the hood of his truck, while the crew drank coffee and the morning got marginally lighter. He'd printed the drawings Friday night, hand-sketched on graph paper and traced in ink the way he'd always done, because he'd tried the digital drafting software twice and found it added time without adding clarity. The drawing showed the north section's structural condition, the compromised rafter connections marked in red, the load distribution analysis, the proposed repair sequence. Roy looked at the drawings for a long time without speaking. These connections here, he said finally, pointing at 2 of the marked rafters near the ridge. These aren't just moisture damage. No, Mason agreed. Something was done to these. Somebody sistered a repair onto the original rafter. Look at the profile here. That's not the original timber. And the sister connection was nailed, not bolted. He shook his head. This is somebody's weekend fix from 10, 15 years back. Nails into old-growth timber that's been drying for a century, probably held fine until the weight load from 2 bad winters hit it. That's my read, Mason said. So we're not just repairing failure. We're repairing a bad repair. Yeah. Roy looked at the drawings for another moment. Doable, he said. Slower. I know. What's our deadline? 28 days from today. Roy looked up. Danny whistled low. Carl said nothing, which was more or less Carl's version of whistling. What's the inspection scope? Roy asked. Full structural assessment, foundation, frame, roof system. They'll be looking for load capacity verification, connection integrity, and compliance with the County Historic Structure Maintenance Code. So we can't just stabilize it. We have to actually fix it. We have to actually fix it, Mason confirmed. Roy nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he's already committed and is just finalizing the internal paperwork. All right then, let's go look at it. Victoria worked. That was the thing Mason hadn't expected, though he probably should have, given what he'd already seen of her. She didn't come out to observe. She didn't come out to ask questions and then go back inside to her warm office. She put on her work coat and her salt-stained boots, and she worked. The first morning she spent moving lumber. The delivery had come in on a flatbed and been stacked near the barn's south entrance, which was accessible and logical, except that the actual work was happening on the north end, which meant the materials needed to move about 200 feet across uneven frozen ground. Mason's crew had a hand truck and a basic lumber dolly. Victoria picked up one end of an 8-foot 2x10, waited for Danny to pick up the other end, and started walking. Danny, who was not especially good at masking surprise, looked briefly like he'd been asked to move lumber by a figure from mythology who had unexpectedly materialized in a construction yard. I've got it, he said. I know you do, Victoria said, and now we have it together, so it'll go faster. Danny looked at Mason over Victoria's head with an expression that was equal parts confused and impressed. Mason made a small gesture that communicated just, go with it, and went back to his structural drawings. By mid-morning, she had moved lumber, carried concrete anchoring supplies, and spent an hour working with Carl to clear debris from inside the north stall section. Rotted hay, broken stall hardware, and a truly impressive accumulation of what appeared to be old machinery parts that had been stored and then forgotten. She worked without complaining and without stopping, and the only concession she made to being someone who didn't do this every day was that she was slower than the crew and she knew it, and she positioned herself consistently on tasks where her pace didn't create a bottleneck. Mason noticed all of this and said nothing about it. At lunch, sandwiches from a deli in town that Dale Archer had apparently arranged, which arrived in brown paper bags exactly at noon. The crew sat on sawhorses and lumber stacks in the south section while the wind worked the exterior. Roy ate with the precise efficiency of a man who regarded lunch as a refueling operation. Danny told a story about a previous job that Mason was fairly sure had been substantially embellished since its original telling. Carl listened and didn't comment. Victoria sat on the end of a stack of 2x12s and ate half a sandwich and read something on her phone. Mason sat near the north partition wall and ate his lunch and made notes. He could see, through the gap in the partition, the first of the compromised rafter connections they'd be working on tomorrow. He was running the rigging sequence for the third time in his head, looking for the angle he might have missed. Your daughter, Victoria said. He looked up. The rest of the crew were talking about something else. She doing better? Victoria asked. The fever had broken Sunday morning. Emma had spent the day demanding cartoons and soup and had been back at school Monday with the complete resilience of a child who treats illness as an inconvenience rather than a story worth telling. She's fine, Mason said, bounced back fast. She's something, Victoria said. The thing she said, about the foundation. Yeah, I keep thinking about that. I'd been in this barn every day for a week before you arrived. I'd looked at that wall 100 times. I didn't see what she saw. She wasn't trying to see anything specific, Mason said. That's the difference. When you go in looking for what's wrong, you organize what you're seeing around the thing you expect to find. She just looked. Victoria considered that. And what were you expecting to find? He paused. Honest answer, he'd been expecting to find what he'd mostly found before. An old structure that had been allowed to deteriorate past the point where rehabilitation made more sense than controlled removal. He'd been expecting to confirm an inevitability. He'd been ready to do it kindly, but he'd been ready to do it. Something worse, he said. She looked at him steadily. You were going to tell me to tear it down. It wasn't really a question, but he answered it. Part of it, yeah, the north section. But Emma showed me the gap. I put the gap together with everything else and understood what was actually happening. He looked at the wall. I should have seen it myself. I was reading the conclusion before I'd finished reading the evidence. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "You're very honest," she said. "Dale told me that. I thought it was a professional thing, like a selling point. But it's not, is it? It's just how you are." Mason wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he took a bite of his sandwich and looked at his notes. "Is that ever a problem?" she asked. "Pretty regularly," he said. Thursday came with the storm it had promised. It arrived around 3 in the afternoon, and it came in not as snow, but as ice. Freezing rain that turned the world outside the barn into something that sounded like static, a constant low hiss of ice crystals hitting every surface available to them. The temperature had dropped 9 degrees since morning. The wind was coming from the northwest at sustained 22 miles per hour, with gusts that hit the north face of the barn and made the whole structure do the thing that old timber frames do. Breathe, Mason called it in his head, because there was no better word for the subtle flex and creak of a building responding to lateral load the way it was designed to do, 1,000 times, without failing. The crew had gotten the first 3 rafter connections prepped before the storm hit. Not repaired, prepped, which meant the compromised sections were exposed, assessed, and staged for the actual repair work. It had taken 3 days of careful work, working at height inside a 50-foot barn in 20-degree temperatures with the kind of precision that old-growth timber demands. You couldn't rush the exposure work because rushing it meant finding out what you damaged only after the damage was done. They were still in the barn when the storm arrived, finishing the staging on the 3rd connection. Mason had everyone down from the scaffolding within 20 minutes of the first real gusts. He wasn't willing to have anyone working at elevation with ice rain creating surface conditions on platforms that were already perched on uneven old stone floors. They waited it out in the south section, which was the most weather-tight part of the structure. Danny and Carl played cards. Roy looked at the structural drawings. Mason stood near the south door, with one panel pushed slightly open, watching the storm move across the estate grounds and thinking about sequencing and timing. Victoria appeared from the estate house around 4, moving across the ice-covered ground with the careful, deliberate stride he was beginning to recognize. She ducked in through the south door and pushed it shut behind her, and brought a gust of freezing air and the smell of the storm with her. She pulled down her hood. Her hair was wet at the edges. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Storm's manageable," Mason said. "The issue is tomorrow. If this ices everything over tonight, the scaffolding setup is going to need to be reevaluated before anyone goes up." "How much time does that cost us?" "Half a day. Maybe a full day depending on how bad the surface conditions are in the morning." She absorbed this. He watched her do the math, the same math he'd already done, the 30-day window compressing by another day, the inspection date fixed and immovable. "We still make it?" she asked. "If nothing else goes wrong, yes." She looked at him. They both understood what the qualifier in that sentence meant. Roy looked up from the drawings. "You know," he said to no one in particular, in the tone of someone who has decided to say something they've been holding for a while, "I worked on the old Callaway stable over on Route 14 about 15 years back. Similar structure, similar era, similar condition. The owner's son kept asking me every morning whether we were going to make his deadline." "What'd you tell him?" Danny asked. "Told him every morning, same thing. The barn doesn't care about your deadline. You can't threaten a building into cooperating. You just do the work right, and the work takes the time it takes." He went back to the drawings. There was a brief silence. "Is that meant to be comforting?" Victoria asked. "No," Roy said pleasantly. "It's meant to be accurate." Mason looked at his watch, then at the storm through the door gap. "I need to check the weatherproofing on the north section before it gets dark," he said. "The batten strips on the center panel swung. I want to verify they're holding with this wind load." "I'll come," Victoria said. "You don't need to." "I know." She pulled her hood back up. "I want to see it." They went around the north face of the barn in the full force of the storm, moving along the foundation wall with their shoulders turned into the wind. The ice rain was fine and constant and found every gap between collar and jaw, every exposed inch of wrist between glove and cuff. Mason moved quickly, running his flashlight up the wall to the roof edge, checking each of the 3 weatherproofed sections. The first 2 were holding. The battens were tight, the sheeting was pressed flat against the sheathing boards by the wind rather than being pulled away from them, which meant the adhesive had held. The third one, the largest, covering the section nearest the north gable, had a problem. One of the batten strips on the upper right corner had pulled free. Not catastrophically. The sheeting was still in place, held by the remaining battens and by gravity, but the freed corner was lifting and slapping in the gusts, pulling the adhesive bond along that edge with each motion. If it went fully free in tonight's wind, the sheeting would tear. The section would be exposed. Ice rain would hit the compromised rafter connections directly. Mason looked at it for 2 seconds, and then he was moving, back to the south entrance, to the equipment storage, grabbing the extension ladder and the cordless drill and a handful of batten strips and the construction adhesive gun. He was back at the north face in 4 minutes. "Hold the ladder," he said to Victoria, and she took it without comment and braced it against the frozen ground and held it while he went up. The wind at elevation was considerably worse than at ground level. It hit him sideways with the full force of a February gust, and he gripped the ladder with one hand and waited for it to ease, then kept going. At the top, he could reach the freed corner of the sheeting. He worked fast, pressing the corner down, running a new bead of adhesive under it, pressing it again, then placing a new batten strip and driving screws through it into the sheathing board below. The drill slipped on the second screw because his hands were cold and wet, and he lost the screw and had to reach into his vest pocket for another one. He found it, placed it, drove it. The batten held. He did 2 more screws along the upper edge for redundancy, then came back down the ladder. His hands were shaking slightly from the cold. He was aware of this and not embarrassed by it. It was 22 degrees and he'd been working exposed for 8 minutes. His hands were supposed to shake. Victoria was still holding the ladder when he reached the ground. Her face was very close to his in the narrow space between the ladder and the barn wall, close enough that he registered the ice on her eyelashes, which was an absurd and specific detail that his brain apparently decided to file and keep. "Is it holding?" she said. She had to raise her voice over the wind. "Should hold through the night," he said. "Should," she repeated. "Should." She looked up at the section, then back at him. They were still very close to each other in the narrow space, and neither of them moved for a second. The storm was loud around them. Then Mason stepped back and picked up the ladder, and they both moved back toward the south entrance with their heads down. And the moment, whatever it had been, whatever it was going to have been, if he'd stood there a second longer, dissolved into the storm behind them. It held through the night. Mason knew because he drove back to the estate at 6 the next morning before the crew arrived and checked it. He told himself he was doing it for professional reasons. He did it because he hadn't slept well, and the alternative to checking was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about whether the batten screws he'd driven in the dark in a windstorm had gone in straight enough. They had. He stood in the clear, brutal cold of the morning after the storm and looked at the north section and felt something he recognized as relief, which was different from the satisfaction of solving a structural problem. Satisfaction was intellectual. Relief had a physical quality to it, a loosening somewhere in the chest. He was still standing there when his phone buzzed, a text from an unsaved number. It held, "Thank you for going up last night. V." He looked at the message for a moment. He wasn't sure exactly when she'd gotten his number. Probably from Dale Archer, which was fine. She was the client. She should have his number. He typed, "Good morning? Yes. Crew starts at 8, Corso arrives day after tomorrow. We're still on schedule." He stared at that for a second, then he added, "How's the sleeping?" He sent it before he'd fully decided to. The response came back in about a minute. 4 hours. Better than Tuesday. He put his phone in his pocket and looked at the barn in the early morning light, thinking about nothing in particular and several things at once. Danny's truck pulled in off the driveway, and Mason walked over to meet it, and the day began again the way days on a construction site always began. With the particular purposeful noise of people arriving to work, the sound of truck doors and equipment cases and voices cutting through cold air, and the quiet, grounding fact of a problem that was still there and still needed solving and wouldn't solve itself. He was glad of that. The problem needing solving. He was glad to have somewhere to put his attention. He had a feeling it was going to be a complicated 30 days. Corso arrived on day 9 instead of day 8. 1 day late because his previous job, a timber frame church restoration 2 counties over, had developed a problem on the final morning that he couldn't leave half solved. Mason knew about it because Corso had called at 7 a.m. and explained it without apology, which was one of the things Mason respected about him. He didn't manufacture excuses. He just told you what was true and let you work with it. The one-day delay cost them the buffer Mason had built into the second week's schedule. There was no longer any room for another weather hold or a material delivery problem or any of the dozen other small failures that accumulated on every job like sediment in a pipe. They were running without margin now. Every day had to produce exactly what it was supposed to produce. Mason explained this to the crew on the morning Corso arrived, standing in a semicircle near the scaffolding base while the temperature sat at 19 degrees and their breath came out in small white clouds. He said it plainly, without drama, because that was how he operated. The crew deserved to know where they stood, and sugarcoating the timeline didn't change the timeline. "So we're tight," Danny said. "We're tight," Mason confirmed. "How tight?" 3 days of buffer left. We burned through that and we're asking the inspection to move, which they won't move it, Carl said. It wasn't a question. The bank sets the date. The bank doesn't care about our sequencing problems. Mason looked at Corso. "You've seen the drawings. Talk to me about the rafter connections." Corso was a compact, quiet man of about 50, with the permanently squinted eyes of someone who spent most of his working life looking upward at structural things in bad light. He'd reviewed Mason's drawings on the drive over and walked the scaffolding for 20 minutes when he arrived, saying nothing, just looking. Now he folded his arms and looked at the ridge. "The two middle connections are worse than your drawings show," he said. "How much worse?" "The sister repair on connection 4. Whoever did that used green lumber. It's dried and twisted inside the connection. The nails are at about 40% of their original shear capacity." He paused. "I want to do a full replacement on that one, not a repair. Pull the sister in new material, through bolt it." "That adds time." "It adds a day, but if we just patch it, there's a real chance the inspector sees the original bad repair and flags it anyway, and then we're having a conversation about whether the connection meets code, and that conversation takes longer than the day we'd save." Mason thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. "Do it right," he said. "Full replacement." Roy, who was standing at the edge of the group listening, nodded once in the way that meant he agreed and had expected nothing different. That was how the second week began. Already behind, already making harder calls, already trading the schedule they'd wanted for the schedule that was actually possible. Corso worked at elevation the way some people worked underwater, with a focused, unhurried deliberateness that seemed at odds with the environment, but produced results faster than urgency would have. Mason worked beside him on the scaffolding for the first 2 days, and Danny worked the lift lines from below, and Carl managed the material staging. Roy spent those days on the north wall, beginning the wall plate assessment, the work that would determine whether the gap Emma had spotted could be corrected and how. Victoria worked. She was there every morning before the crew arrived, and she stayed until the light was gone, which in February meant she stayed until 5, and then continued doing administrative work on the estate that she'd pushed to the evening to make room for the barn during the day. Mason knew this because Dale Archer mentioned it once, in passing, with the tone of someone who had given up trying to argue with the decision that had already been made. She learned fast. Not construction skills specifically. She wasn't pretending to be a carpenter, and nobody expected her to be. But she learned the site. She learned which tasks were the through lines that the whole sequence depended on and which were peripheral. She learned when to ask questions and when the question could wait until the end of the day. She learned the names of things: rafter, ridge board, wall plate, through bolt, shear load, and she used them correctly when she needed to communicate something, which meant the communication was faster and lost less in translation. Danny warmed to her completely by day 3. This was not difficult. Danny warmed to most people by day 3, but with Victoria, it was genuine rather than social. She had a dry, quiet sense of humor that surfaced occasionally in the spaces between the harder moments, and Danny appreciated it visibly. He started deferring to her on material staging questions without being asked to, which was his version of trust. Carl was more reserved, which was Carl being Carl. But Mason noticed that when Victoria said something about the structural work that was technically accurate, Carl would give a small nod that he gave to almost no one. For Carl, that was practically a standing ovation. Roy watched her with the thoughtful attention of someone assembling a portrait. He didn't say much. He worked, and Mason watched all of it. The crew, the barn, the progress, the weather, and tried to maintain the professional distance that the situation technically called for. He was not entirely succeeding at the professional distance. The thing was, it kept catching him off guard. Not any single thing. A collection of things that didn't individually mean anything but were collectively becoming difficult to ignore. The way she handed him coffee in the morning without being asked and without making it a moment. The way she talked about her father. Not often, not performatively, but sometimes in the evenings when the crew had gone and they were doing the end-of-day walkthrough, she would say something that landed a piece of the picture. The way she worked, which told you things about a person that conversation sometimes didn't. The patience of it. The willingness to do things that were unglamorous. The absence of any apparent expectation that the work would accommodate her. On day 11, he was on the scaffolding with Corso finishing the through-bolt installation on connection 4 when he heard her below talking to Roy. He wasn't trying to listen. The barn's acoustics were what they were. "Your father designed this himself?" Roy was asking. "He had an architect for the structure," Victoria said. "But the layout, the stall configuration, the arena space, that was his. He knew exactly how he wanted it to work." "What was he building it for?" A pause. Then, "A riding center for families in the valley. He grew up in Blackwood Ridge. His family didn't have money, and there was no place for kids around here to learn to ride who couldn't afford private lessons. He always said that." Another pause, shorter. "He spent about 20 years building the business to the point where he could afford to do the community project he'd wanted to do when he was 12. And then he died before he finished it," Roy said. 3 months before the first phase was supposed to open. Her voice was steady. Not flat. Steady, which is different. The voice of someone who has had this conversation with the grief enough times to carry it without it carrying them. "The debt situation. The problems I'm dealing with now. A lot of it came from his medical costs in the last 2 years. He didn't tell me how bad it was. He didn't want me to—" She stopped, started differently. "He was protecting me from a problem that I then had to deal with alone because I didn't know it was coming." "That's a particular kind of hard," Roy said. "Yeah." Mason, above them, drove the next through bolt with careful, quiet strokes. On day 13, the North Wall Plate assessment came back with results that were better than Mason had feared and worse than he'd hoped, which was the standard condition of things on a job like this. Roy sat with him in the south section at the end of the day. The drawings spread on the lumber stack between them and walked him through it. The wall plate, the heavy horizontal timber that sat on top of the foundation stone and carried the weight of the wall frame above, had experienced the deflection he'd expected. In 3 sections along the north wall, the plate had dropped between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch from its original position, creating the gap at the foundation interface that Emma had spotted. The plate itself was still structurally sound. The stone below it was still structurally sound. The problem was the gap, which created a connection discontinuity, which meant load transfer between wall and foundation was happening through contact rather than proper bearing. "We can jack it," Roy said. "Controlled hydraulic jacking, bring it back to bearing. But we need to do it after the rafter loads are corrected, not before. If we jack the plate before Corso finishes the ridge work, we're trying to push the wall back into position while the roof is still shoving it down." "Sequence it after connection 6 is secured," Mason said. "That's day 17 minimum." 17, Mason repeated. He looked at the calendar he kept taped to the inside of his notebook cover. The inspection was day 30. That left 13 days after the jacking to do the permanent weatherproofing, the interior repairs, the documentation, and a final pre-inspection walk with Roy to make sure there was nothing they'd missed. 13 days for work that would normally take 3 weeks. "We can do it," Roy said. He didn't say it optimistically. He said it the way someone states a fact that they know is true and don't feel the need to dress up. "It'll be long days, but we can do it." Mason nodded. He folded the drawings and put them back in his bag. Victoria had been sitting on a sawbuck 10 feet away, going through paperwork on a clipboard while they talked. She'd been there for the whole conversation, not intruding, not asking questions that would interrupt the technical assessment. Now she looked up. 13 days, she said. 13 days, Mason confirmed. She looked at the clipboard for a moment, then she set it aside and looked at him directly. "Tell me what you need from me." "Right now?" Right now and for the rest of this. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. Early starts. I need the south section cleared of those remaining machine parts by tomorrow morning. The crew needs it for staging the jacking equipment. I need Dale to confirm the hydraulic jack delivery for day 16. And I need... He paused. What? I need you to be ready for the possibility that something else goes wrong, he said. Not because I think it will, but because on a job this compressed, when something goes wrong and the person who needs to make a decision about it has to first process the shock of it going wrong, that costs us time we don't have. If you can be in a mental place where you're expecting problems, so they don't surprise me when they happen. Yeah, she held his gaze for a moment. I've been expecting problems since before you got here, she said quietly. That's not new. He believed her. It showed in the way she worked, the preparedness of it, the absence of the entitled expectation that things would cooperate. She'd been braced for difficulty for a long time, long before the barn, long before the bank and the inspection deadline. All right, he said. Emma came back on day 15. It was a Saturday, which meant no school, and Mason had come in on a Saturday because the hydraulic jack delivery had been moved up a day, and he needed to supervise the staging. He told Emma she could come if she stayed out of the active work areas, and she'd agreed with the immediate, fervent agreement of a child who has already decided where she wants to be and is not interested in negotiating. She was wearing her purple hat and carrying Captain, and she walked into the barn with the comfortable familiarity of a place she'd already mapped in her head and remembered accurately. Victoria was in the south section organizing the material inventory when Emma walked in. She looked up, and something happened in her face that was immediate and unguarded in a way that Mason rarely saw from her. Emma, she said. Hi, Ms. Whitmore. Emma looked around the barn with the systematic inspection of someone cataloging changes. It looks different in here. It does, Victoria agreed. Come see. They walked the barn together while Mason dealt with the jack delivery at the south entrance, Victoria pointing out the scaffolding on the north end, the repaired connections visible above, the cleared stall section that had been prepped for the next phase. Emma asked questions with the particular quality that her questions had always had, which was that they were always the question underneath the obvious question. Why do the rafters have to be bolted instead of nailed? She asked. Because bolts create a clamping force, Victoria said, and Mason could hear in her voice that she was working with information she had absorbed in the last 2 weeks. Nails just hold by friction. When the load shifts, nails can pull out. Bolts hold even when things move. So it's like, Emma thought about this, like how a seatbelt is better than just holding on. That's exactly what it's like, Victoria said. I'm going to use that explanation from now on. Emma looked up at the scaffolding. Can I go up? No, Mason said from across the barn. Emma did not look surprised. I figured, she said. Later, at midday, Emma had installed herself in the south section with a drawing pad that she apparently carried in her coat pocket along with an impressive array of other supplies. 2 pencils, a small ruler, a granola bar that she'd already eaten, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map of what she called places I want to see before I'm 10, which included 3 states, 1 national park, and the Whitmore Estate stable, which she had apparently added to the list at some point in the last 2 weeks. Victoria sat down beside her and looked at the map. She was quiet for a moment. You put the stable on here, she said. Emma nodded seriously. I added it after last time, because it's a place I want to come back to. She looked at Victoria. Is that weird? No, Victoria said. Her voice had gone to the quiet register again, the one that wasn't sadness exactly, but was adjacent to it. I think that's the nicest thing anyone said about this place in a long time. Emma seemed satisfied with this and went back to her drawing. Mason, from across the room, had watched this exchange over the top of his notebook. He looked back down at his calculations. He wrote a number that he immediately crossed out because it was wrong. He wrote it again. He looked back across the room. Emma was drawing. Victoria was looking at Emma's map. The afternoon light came through the south windows at a low winter angle and laid itself across the concrete floor in wide, pale rectangles. He looked back at his notebook. He did not write anything for about 40 seconds. Day 17 arrived with a sky the color of old dishwater and a temperature that had dropped back to single digits overnight, which was February, deciding to remind everyone that the calendar's concessions to late winter were temporary and could be revoked. The hydraulic jacking was the most technically demanding single operation of the entire project. Mason had explained this to Victoria the night before, sitting in the estate kitchen after the crew had gone. The kitchen was where the end-of-day conversations had migrated over the past week by unspoken mutual agreement, because it was warm and had a table large enough for drawings, and was, Mason had come to understand, the room in the estate house where Victoria actually lived when she wasn't working. Not the formal rooms he'd glimpsed through doorways. The kitchen. The one with the worn wooden table and the mismatched chairs and the coffee maker that had apparently been there since her father's time. He'd laid out the jacking sequence. 4 jacking points along the north wall, controlled lifts of no more than 1/8 of an inch per pass, each pass followed by an assessment of the rafter load response above. If the ridge work was complete and the load path was corrected, the jacking would bring the plate back to bearing against the foundation stones and the gap would close. If anything in the rafter system above was not yet fully secured, the jacking could shift load into the wrong place and create a new problem faster than they could respond to it. "What's the failure scenario?" Victoria had asked. "If there's an unsecured load path above when we jack, the worst case is a rafter connection failing under the redistributed load, which would mean the roof. A section of the roof, yes." He'd looked at her. "It won't happen. Corso finished the last connection yesterday. Roy and I walked the whole ridge this afternoon. Every connection is secured and through-bolted." He'd paused. "But I'm telling you the failure scenario because you asked, and because you asked me to be honest about what could go wrong." She'd looked at him for a moment across the table. "Have you done this before? The jacking on a historic timber frame?" "Twice. Both times successfully." "What happened on the unsuccessful version?" He'd looked at her steadily. "There hasn't been an unsuccessful version, but you know what it would look like." "Yes. And you're confident enough that it won't look like that to proceed tomorrow?" "I am." She'd nodded. Then she'd poured more coffee into both mugs without asking and gone back to her paperwork. And he'd gone back to his drawings. And they'd sat like that for another hour in the warm kitchen with the winter pressing against the windows, each in their own work. And it had been one of the most comfortable hours Mason had spent in a very long time, which was not a comfortable thing to acknowledge. Now, on day 17, standing at the north wall with Roy, at 6:15 in the morning, Mason ran the pre-jack checklist with the careful attention of a man who has told someone the worst case won't happen and intends to make that true. Corso was on the scaffolding doing a final visual on connections 1 through 6. Carl had the jacking equipment staged. Danny had the monitoring station set, 4 points along the ridge where he would watch the connection hardware during each lift increment and call down any movement. "Ready?" Roy said. "Ready," Mason said. Roy put his hand on the first jack and looked at Mason with the quiet eyes of a man who had done hard work for 40 years and was not afraid of hard work. "Slow and steady," Roy said. "Slow and steady," Mason agreed. The jacking took 6 hours, not because something went wrong, because doing it right at the pace it required to be right took 6 hours. Each 1/8-inch increment, each pause, each assessment from Danny above and Roy below and Mason everywhere at once, moving between the 4 jacking points, reading the structure's response, checking the foundation interface, communicating with Corso on the ridge. The barn talked to them the whole time in the language of old timber under load, creaks and pops, and the occasional low groan that made everyone's shoulders tighten until Mason read it and confirmed it was normal movement and not distress. Victoria stood near the south partition the entire time. She didn't pace. She stood, arms folded, watching. Occasionally she handed someone a tool or a measurement sheet. Mostly she just stood and watched and held whatever she was holding inside herself without letting it show in any way that would put extra weight on the room. Around hour 4, Danny called down from his monitoring position at the 3rd rafter cluster. "Movement at connection 3. Every person in the barn went still. "Define movement," Mason called up. A pause. Mason could picture Danny up there with his flashlight on the hardware, looking at it with the new style focus he got when something actually required it. "Settling," Danny called. "Hardware is moving into seat. It's seating under the load, not pulling." Another pause. "It's good. It's what you want." The shoulders in the room came down by about half an inch collectively. Continue, Mason said, and Roy went back to the fourth jack. At hour 6, Roy straightened up from the final jacking point and looked at Mason. She's back, he said. Mason crouched at the foundation interface on the north wall, the northeast corner where the gap had been widest, the place Emma had pointed at 3 weeks ago in the cold. He ran his fingers along the base of the wall plate. The gap was closed. Not perfect. Nothing in a restoration was perfect, and perfection wasn't what they were building toward. They were building toward structural integrity, toward load paths that functioned correctly, toward connections that would hold. But the plate was back and bearing contact with the stone below it. The load was transferring correctly, and the deflection that had been pulling the north wall off its foundation was no longer being driven from above. He stood up. The crew was looking at him with the quiet, tired attention of people who have done something hard and want to know if it worked. Good, Mason said. It's good. Danny made a sound that wasn't quite a cheer and wasn't quite a laugh, but was somewhere between the two. Carl looked at the wall with the expression of someone confirming a calculation they'd already run in their head. Roy put down his hydraulic wrench with the careful deliberateness of a craftsman putting down a tool at the end of a thing done correctly. Victoria unfolded her arms. Mason looked at her across the barn. She was backlit by the south windows, and the expression on her face was something he didn't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. More like the expression of someone seeing a thing they'd stopped letting themselves fully want suddenly become possible. He looked away before it did anything he wasn't ready for. 13 days, he said to the room. We've got 13 days to close this out. Let's not waste the afternoon. That night, Mason stayed later than he'd planned. He was doing the post-jack documentation, measurements, photographs, the written record that would accompany the inspection, and it ran long because good documentation always ran long. The crew had left at 5:30. The barn was quiet except for the wind and the occasional tick of the timber frame cooling in the night air. He was finishing the last of the foundation measurements when he heard the kitchen door of the estate house open, and a few minutes later Victoria appeared in the south doorway with 2 mugs and her coat over her shoulders. She walked to where he was working and set one mug near his equipment bag without comment, and sat on the lumber stack nearby, and didn't ask if he was almost done or how much longer he'd be there. She just sat. He finished the measurements. He wrote them in the notebook. He looked at the wall plate one more time. Can I ask you something? He said. Yeah. The writing center. He turned to look at her. When this is done, when the inspection passes and the foreclosure threat is removed, is it actually going to happen? The community center your father wanted. She looked at her mug for a moment. That's what the restoration scope says. Phase 2 of the project is converting the South Arena section into a proper indoor riding facility. Stalls for 12 horses, lesson ring, observation area. She paused. Whether I can fund Phase 2 after everything that's gone into Phase 1 and the debt restructuring is... She stopped. It's complicated. But you want to. My father wanted to. I want to finish what he started. She looked at Mason. Is that the same thing? Wanting something because someone you loved wanted it? He thought about this carefully. I think it can be both, he said. Something that starts as finishing someone else's thing can become yours while you're doing it. She looked at him for a moment. Has that happened to you? He thought about the moment in the barn 3 weeks ago when he'd looked at this structure and found himself unable to deliver the verdict he'd driven 40 miles to deliver. When something about it, the foundation that wasn't dying, or the woman who had gotten here before dawn with a crowbar, or his daughter crouching in the snow and pointing at the truth, had shifted the job from a contract to something he didn't have a clean name for yet. Yeah, he said. I think it's happening to me right now, actually. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was looking at the wall plate, at the gap that was no longer there. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of information. Mason, she said. He looked at her then. She was watching him with the steady, open attention she'd had from the first day. The look that didn't look away and didn't perform and just held whatever it was looking at without flinching. Thank you, she said. Not for the work, or not only for the work. He didn't answer that immediately because the honest answer was complex and he hadn't sorted it yet, and he had a long-standing policy of not saying things he hadn't sorted. 13 days, he said finally. She almost smiled. You keep saying that. It's my way of dealing with things I can't process until the job is done. She did smile then. The full one. The one that changed her face completely. The one he'd seen maybe 4 times in 3 weeks, and had apparently started filing in a specific location in his memory without being asked to. 13 days, she said. He stood up, gathered his equipment, and said goodnight and walked out into the cold. He drove home thinking about load paths and jacking sequences and the particular way old timber sounds when it comes back to bearing after years of moving in the wrong direction. He thought about that sound for a long time. It sounded, against all his practical instincts, like something beginning. 13 days turned out to be 11. Not because things got easier, because Mason pushed harder than he probably should have, and the crew pushed with him without being asked. And somewhere around day 20, the job had shifted into the thing that happened occasionally on a restoration project when enough people cared enough about the outcome. When the work stopped feeling like work and started feeling like an argument you were winning against something that had been losing for years. The permanent weatherproofing on the north section went down on day 18. Real roofing, not polyethylene sheeting. New cedar shingles over replaced sheathing boards where the originals had rotted, counterflashing at the wall intersections, ridge cap installed with the attention to detail that Roy applied to every finished surface regardless of whether it would ever be directly visible to anyone. Mason had learned years ago not to tell Roy to cut corners on finish work. Roy had a specific look he gave you when you suggested that, and it was not a pleasant look to receive. The interior stall repairs ran parallel. Carl and Danny rebuilding the stall partition walls, replacing the damaged hardware, repointing the stone foundation along the interior face with a lime mortar mix that matched the original composition closely enough to satisfy the historic structure code requirements. Mason had sourced the mortar from a specialty supplier 3 hours away because the standard modern mix would have shown up like a scar on the old stone, and the inspection's historic maintenance clause specifically addressed material compatibility. Corso left on day 19, after a final walkthrough of all 6 rafter connections that took 2 hours and produced a written condition assessment that Mason would include in the inspection documentation. Before he left, he shook Mason's hand in the particular way he shook hands. 2 pumps, firm, no wasted motion, and said, "Clean job, you ran it right." Coming from Corso, that was the structural equivalent of a standing ovation. Victoria watched him leave from the barn doorway, then turned to Mason. "Is it bad that I wanted him to stay and say something more dramatic?" "He's not a dramatic guy," Mason said. "I noticed. After 3 days, I stopped waiting for it. That's how he works. He does good work, and then he leaves. The work does the talking." She considered this. "Is that how you work too?" He thought about it honestly. "Used to be," he said. "I'm apparently getting more talkative in my old age." She made a small sound that might have been a laugh, short, genuine, surprised out of her rather than offered, and went back inside to her paperwork. Mason stood in the barn doorway a moment longer and looked at the north section. At the repaired rafters, the new sheathing visible where the damaged sections had been replaced, the overall line of the roof resolving back into something coherent. It was starting to look like a barn that was alive instead of dying. He went back to work. Day 20 brought the storm that changed everything. The Weather Service had tracked it for 4 days, which was long enough that everyone in the valley knew it was coming and short enough that nobody could agree on exactly how bad it would be. The models kept shifting. One pass had it as a heavy snow event, 12 to 18 inches, serious but manageable. The next pass had it as a mixed precipitation nightmare, the kind of February system where the temperature sat exactly at the transition point between snow and ice, and the atmosphere couldn't commit, so it threw both at you simultaneously. What actually came down on the morning of day 20 was something that didn't need a precise meteorological classification. It was bad. That was sufficient. Mason was already at the estate when it started, had been there since 5:30 finishing the foundation documentation. The first bands came through around 7 as light snow, manageable, and by 8 it had hardened into the mixed sleet and freezing rain variety that turned every horizontal surface into a skating rink within 20 minutes. The temperature was sitting at 31 degrees, which was that particular cruelty of the transitional zone. Just warm enough to be wet, just cold enough to freeze on contact. The crew got there by 8:15, navigating what Danny described as the most committed attempt by a road to kill him personally that he'd ever encountered. They gathered in the south section, and Mason laid out the day. The roofing on the north section was complete. The interior work was mostly complete. What remained, and what had to happen before the inspection in 10 days, was the permanent exterior siding repair on the north wall, which required working on scaffolding on the barn's exterior north face, and the final foundation documentation along the interior perimeter. The siding work was weather-dependent. The documentation was not. Interior documentation today, Mason said. Siding waits for the storm to clear. When does it clear? Carl asked. Mason looked at the weather on his phone. Tomorrow afternoon, maybe. And if it doesn't? Then we work Thursday and Friday on a Saturday schedule, and we finish siding with 3 days to spare before the inspection. Nobody asked what happened if that didn't work. They understood the math, and they were professionals. And professional silence is sometimes the most useful response. What nobody in that conversation anticipated was what happened at 2 in the afternoon. Mason was on the interior north wall, crouched at the foundation doing final measurements, when he heard the sound. He'd been in enough buildings under stress to have a catalog of sounds that the human nervous system correctly identifies as wrong before the brain has time to analyze why. This sound entered that category immediately. A creak that was longer and lower and fundamentally different from the normal thermal movement of old timber in cold weather. It came from the northeast corner, above him, and it lasted about 2 seconds. He was on his feet before it finished. "Carl," he said, in the flat, controlled voice he used when a situation was developing faster than the time available for complete sentences. Northeast corner, upper rafter. Carl was across the barn. He looked up at the corner Mason had indicated. His face did the specific thing it did when he was registering something serious. Not panic, nothing like panic, but a complete stillness that was actually more alarming than panic because Carl never went still unless the situation genuinely warranted it. "Connection 3, Carl said. "The bolt is—" He didn't finish the sentence because the next sound was immediate and much louder. The crack of a timber under sudden load redistribution, and then a section of the newly repaired ceiling in the northeast corner shifted downward by about 4 inches and stopped. Stopped, because the adjacent connections held. But the exterior wall above it, the section of north wall siding that had not yet been permanently repaired, that was currently held in place by the temporary measures they'd installed in week 1, had taken the shift in load and one of the temporary braces had kicked out. Mason saw all of this in approximately 3 seconds. He also saw that the section of temporary siding above the kicked brace was now being held by 1 anchor point instead of 2, and that the wind outside, the storm still running at sustained 25 with gusts, was hitting the north face with load that the temporary anchor was not designed to handle alone. "Everyone out of the north section," he said. Not a shout. Clear, level, the kind of voice that moves people without creating the chaos that shouting creates. Danny was already moving. Roy moved without being told. Roy had the instincts of 40 years, and they had kicked in at the first sound. Carl took 2 steps back and then stopped because he was looking at something. "Mason," Carl said. Mason looked where Carl was looking. The anchor point was pulling free. Not fast, but visibly, incrementally. The screw anchors were walking out of the damaged wall framing they were set into, pulling a little more with each gust. When they pulled free completely, the upper section of temporary siding was going to swing outward on the remaining lower nails, and then likely tear free entirely. And the weather opening it created would dump ice and freezing rain directly onto the northeast rafter cluster, and specifically onto Connection 3, which had just demonstrated that it was under more stress than it should be. If Connection 3 failed under that combined load before they could intervene, they were looking at a section of roof coming down. Not the whole structure, not that the rest of the frame was secure, but a section. Enough to require work they no longer had time to do before the inspection. Enough, potentially, to fail the inspection. "I can get to it," Danny said. He was looking at the exterior scaffolding access from the south face. "If I go around the exterior—" "In this weather," Roy said, "the scaffolding is still up on the north face. I can traverse it." "You'll be on ice-covered scaffolding in a 30-mile-an-hour wind," Mason said. "Yeah." Danny looked at him steadily, which was one of the things about Danny that Mason had always respected. The moments when the usual brightness went quiet and what was underneath showed and what was underneath was solid. "I can do it. I've worked worse." "I have harness experience," Mason said. "I'll go." You're heavier than me. Lighter is better on compromised scaffolding in this wind. Danny paused. You know I'm right. Mason looked at the pulling anchor. He looked at the scaffolding route. He looked at the weather through the south door gap, at the ice rain driving sideways across the estate grounds. Full harness. Tether to the main scaffold column at all times. You go for the brace anchor only. You get a replacement screw set into good timber and you come back in. You don't linger. I never linger, Danny said, which in normal circumstances would have been funny, and under these circumstances was just Danny being Danny, which was its own kind of steadying. Mason pulled the replacement anchor hardware from the staging area, while Carl rigged Danny's harness, and Roy stabilized the interior brace below the shifting section. The whole setup took 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which the anchor above continued its slow exodus, and the wind continued doing what wind does. Victoria appeared in the south doorway. She had come from the estate house when she'd seen, through the kitchen window, apparently, the scaffolding movement. She stood in the doorway and took in the scene, and her face did what it did, which was absorb everything and show the minimum, and she looked at Mason. What do you need? She said. Stay here, he said. If Danny calls from the exterior, I need you to be a second set of ears on the interior side. She nodded. No additional questions. She positioned herself where Mason pointed, and she stayed there. Danny went out through the south-face scaffold access and disappeared around the corner of the building, and the barn went quiet except for the wind and the interior creaking and the sound of Roy murmuring to himself slightly as he worked the interior brace. Something Mason had noticed Roy did when he was focused, a low, half-audible commentary that wasn't speech exactly, but served some internal purpose Roy had never explained. 3 minutes of silence. 4. Contact. Danny's voice came through the wall, slightly muffled by the siding. I've got the anchor point. Old screw is half out. I'm pulling it clear and setting the replacement. How's the scaffolding? Mason called. A pause. It's fine. I mean, it's terrible, but the frames are solid. Another pause. Really cold up here. Work faster, Mason said. Working as fast as cold hands work, Danny said. Give me 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Mason stood below the northeast corner watching Connection 3, watching for any further movement. Roy held the interior brace. Carl had his hand against the wall, feeling for vibration. Victoria stood where she'd been placed and watched without moving. Anchor's in, Danny called. 2 screws and new timber. I'm adding a third. Add the third, Mason said. 30 seconds. Third is in. Brace is solid. A pause. The siding section above it is still loose. The lower nails are original and they're shot. This is going to need replacement, not repair. I know. Just make sure it's not going anywhere tonight. It's not going anywhere tonight. Coming in. Danny appeared back through the south scaffold access 4 minutes later, ice-crusted from collar to boots, hands shaking inside his gloves, and with the particular expression of someone who has done something unpleasant and is processing the relief of having done it successfully. He looked at Mason. Next time I say I can do something in bad weather, you should push back harder. You said you could do it. I was right, but it was really unpleasant. He pulled off his outer gloves and his hands were red and stiff. The brace will hold tonight. The siding section needs replacement tomorrow, soon as the storm breaks. I know. We'll be short on the schedule. I know, Danny. Mason put a hand briefly on his shoulder. It lasted about a second and a half, which was about as long as Mason ever held that kind of contact, and then let go. Good work. Danny looked at his hands. Yeah, he said. Okay. The storm broke overnight. By Thursday morning, the sky had cleared to that particular winter blue that follows violent weather, as if the violence had scoured the atmosphere clean, and the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, which was cold but stable, and the sun came out with the full indifferent brightness of a February morning that has no particular interest in warming anything. The crew arrived at 7 and went straight to the north face exterior. The siding replacement took the full day. It was not complicated work, but it was precise work, and on a historic structure, every piece of new material had to be fitted against irregular old framing with the patience that old framing demanded. By 5 o'clock, the north wall exterior was closed, properly sheathed, and sided in a vertical board and batten pattern that matched the original as closely as the available material allowed. Roy stood back and looked at it in the last of the afternoon light. Good, he said. The same word, the same register that Mason had used after the jacking. In the shared vocabulary of the crew, it meant done right. Mason photographed it from 3 angles for the documentation package. He included a note about the connection. 3 incident, the load redistribution, the emergency repair, and the replacement work. He did not soften it or omit it. The documentation was going to the inspector, and the inspector was going to see the repair, and a clear account of what happened and what was done about it was worth more than a careful silence that an experienced inspector would see through anyway. Victoria read the documentation that evening at the kitchen table. She read it slowly, the way she read everything. Not skimming, not looking for conclusions, actually reading. When she got to the section about Connection 3 and the emergency exterior repair, she stopped and read it twice. You included all of it, she said. That's what happened. A lot of contractors would have... She stopped. I know what a lot of contractors would have done, Mason said. I'm not a lot of contractors. She looked at him across the table. Are you worried the inspector will flag it? The connection is secured. The repair is proper. The documentation shows a problem was identified, responded to immediately, and resolved correctly. He paused. Trying to hide a problem and having an inspector find it is a failing grade. Disclosing a problem and showing how it was handled. That's what good structural practice looks like. And if the inspector disagrees, then I'll be there to explain the engineering, and Roy will be there. And Corso's written assessment is in the package. He looked at her steadily. It passes, Victoria. It was the first time he'd used her first name. He wasn't sure afterward whether he'd intended it or whether it had come out because 11 days of 16-hour workdays had worn down the professional register enough to let the more natural one surface. Either way, it was out there, and neither of them commented on it, and the kitchen was warm and the documentation was on the table between them, and outside it was 15 degrees in February. She looked back at the document. 8 days, she said. 8 days. Something happened on day 24 that nobody had planned for. It started with a truck. Mason was outside the barn in the mid-morning doing a final perimeter inspection when a pickup he didn't recognize came up the estate drive, moving slow on the still icy gravel. It parked near the barn entrance and a man got out. Early 60s, rancher's build, wearing a Carhartt jacket that had been washed until it had opinions about it. He looked at the barn. He looked at Mason. You the contractor? He said. I am. Name's Birch. Gene Birch. I run a spread about 6 miles east of here on County Road 7. He looked at the barn again. Heard you all were working on the Whitmore stable. Heard it was tight on time. It is, Mason said carefully. Gene Birch reached into the bed of his truck and pulled out 2 lengths of dressed lumber, the kind that came from a mill rather than a home improvement store, properly dried, straight-grained, the material you used when you needed material that would do what you asked it to do. He set them on the ground near Mason's feet. Got about 40 more lengths in the bed, he said. White oak framing stock. I had it milled last fall for a project that fell through. If you can use it, it's yours. Mason looked at the lumber. He looked at Gene Birch. Why? Gene Birch seemed to regard this as a reasonable question, which it was. He took a moment with it. Harold Whitmore let my family graze on the east pasture for 3 years when we were in a bad drought, and our own pasture was burned down to nothing. Never charged us a cent, said the grass would grow back and neighbors were more important than grazing fees. He shrugged, the way people shrug when they're explaining something that doesn't actually need explanation. I heard his daughter was trying to finish what he started. Figured I had lumber. Before Mason could respond, a second truck came up the drive. Then a third. By noon, there were 7 vehicles on the estate grounds. 2 ranchers with materials. A mechanic from Harwick with a portable generator and a set of tools he said were just taking up space in his shop. A woman named Agnes who ran a small farm supply operation outside town and who had brought, inexplicably and perfectly, exactly the type of lime mortar mix that Mason had been sourcing from 3 hours away, 2 bags of it, because her father had used it for foundation work, and she still had stock. A retired carpenter named Walt, who shook Roy's hand, looked at the north wall and said, "Tell me where you want me," in a way that made it clear he wasn't asking. And a pair of brothers, the Dunn brothers, 22 and 25, who worked at their family's feedlot and had apparently driven 45 minutes on icy roads because they'd heard on some regional agricultural network that the Whitmore stable restoration was a week from an inspection and running thin. Victoria came out of the estate house at noon and stood at the south entrance to the barn and looked at all of it. The trucks, the people, the lumber Jean Birch was unloading, Walt already talking with Roy about something on the drawings. And her face did something that was not the controlled minimum she usually showed. It was not the full version of falling apart either. It was the specific expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for long enough that they've forgotten what it feels like to not carry it alone, and then someone else puts a hand on the load. Mason was standing near her. He didn't say anything. He didn't think this was a moment that wanted words from him specifically. Jean Birch walked over and extended his hand to her. "Miss Whitmore, Jean Birch, County Road 7. She shook his hand. Her grip was steady. Her voice was steady. "Mr. Birch, I know who you are. My father talked about your family. He was a good man. My family owes him." Jean looked at the barn. "Seems like the decent thing is to show up." Victoria nodded once. She looked at the assembled people and equipment and the movement of the morning reorganizing itself around the work that still needed to be done. She pressed her lips together briefly and then let that pass and let her face settle back into the steady expression she operated from. She looked at Mason. "Can you use all of them?" she said. Mason surveyed the available labor and material. Walt was already earning his presence. He was 60-something and walked with a slight hitch, but he was reading the drawings the way you read drawings when you understand what they're saying. The Dunn brothers were young and strong and appeared willing. Agnes's mortar mix was exactly what they needed for the remaining foundation repointing on the east face. "Yeah," he said. "I can use all of them." The next 4 days ran differently than the preceding 23. They ran with more people, more noise, more of the particular organized chaos that descends on a construction site when the labor force doubles overnight and the site foreman has to simultaneously expand the scope of what's happening and maintain the quality that the inspection would require. Mason ran it. He ran it the way he ran everything, by being everywhere, by understanding what each person was capable of and positioning them there, by keeping the sequence clear in his own head even when the surface of the site looked like entropy. Roy managed the skilled work, the finished carpentry on the stall partitions, the final foundation repointing, the connection between old and new material in every place where they met. He and Walt worked together with the wordless efficiency of two people who had spent their lives in the same trade and could communicate through what they did rather than what they said. The Dunn brothers moved material, carried equipment, held things while other people attached them, and asked good questions that indicated they were paying attention. Mason answered every question they asked, not because he had to, but because the questions were honest and honest questions deserved answers. Danny was everywhere, in the way Danny was always everywhere, useful, fast, and visibly enjoying himself in a way that had nothing to do with the severity of the timeline and everything to do with the fact that he genuinely liked working, and working with more people was more working, and that was fine with him. Carl settled into the role of quality control, which nobody had assigned him to, but which he assumed naturally and competently, walking behind each completed section with his quiet eyes and his measuring tape and his willingness to say this needs to be redone without apology when it needed to be redone. Victoria worked alongside all of it, migrating to where she was needed, which showed an understanding of the site's logic that 4 weeks had built into her in the way that being present for something every day builds understanding that no briefing can replicate. She managed the material flow with the Dunn brothers. She ran communication between Dale Archer and the mill supply for a last-minute hardware order. She made coffee in quantities that respected the actual scope of the labor being performed. On the evening of day 27, 3 days before the inspection, Mason stood in the center of the south section and looked at what they had. The north roof section was complete and weather-tight. The north wall was repaired and sided. The rafter connections were secured and documented. The foundation was back in bearing and the wall plate gap was closed. The interior stall partitions were rebuilt and the hardware was in place. The interior foundation repointing was done on all 4 walls. The documentation package was complete, organized, and included every photograph, measurement, material specification, and repair narrative that a structural inspector would expect to see, and then some. Roy came to stand beside him. They stood there together for a moment without speaking. "Did we miss anything?" Mason said. Roy looked at the barn slowly, the full sweep of it, north to south, floor to ridge. He did this with the thoroughness of a man who has been asked a real question and intends to answer it accurately. Connection 2, Roy said. The through-bolt installation report. I want to re-verify the torque spec against what's in the document. I'll pull the hardware records. And the East Foundation interior face, third bay from the north. The repointing that Walt did yesterday. I want to look at it in better light tomorrow. Noted. Roy was quiet for another moment. Other than that, he said, I don't think we missed anything. Mason nodded. You know what this means, Roy said. Yeah. We finished a job that had no business being finished in 30 days in 27 days. 27 days, Mason confirmed. Roy looked at the barn one more time. Then he picked up his jacket and his bag and said goodnight, and the sound of his truck starting up carried clearly through the cold air. Mason stayed a few more minutes. He did that at the end of jobs sometimes, stood in the finished work alone for a few minutes, and let the place show him what it was now compared to what it had been. It was not sentimental exactly. It was more like confirming something. The barn showed him a structure that had been dying from the wrong direction and had been turned around. A load path that had been redirected to run the way it was supposed to run. Stone that had always been solid, now bearing the weight it was designed to bear. A foundation that had never been the problem. He heard the estate kitchen door and didn't turn around. He knew the specific sound of it now. He knew, without looking, the pace of her steps crossing the frozen ground. Victoria came to stand beside him, and she was holding 2 mugs, and she didn't say anything immediately, and neither did he. They stood in the cold looking at the barn together. 3 days, she said finally. 3 days. She handed him one of the mugs. He took it and held it in both hands and felt the warmth of it in the cold air. Mason, she said. He looked at her. He looked. She was looking at the barn, not at him. Her profile in the winter evening light. The straight line of it, the particular set of her jaw that he'd come to understand meant she was holding something she was deciding whether to say. When this is done, she said, and then she stopped. He waited. She turned and looked at him then, and the expression on her face was the open one. Not the controlled minimum, not the professional steadiness, the actual expression. The one he'd seen maybe twice, in unguarded moments, and that he'd been careful not to respond to because the job wasn't done. I don't know what I'm trying to say, she said, which, coming from her, from the person who chose every word with precision and never started a sentence she hadn't planned, was one of the most honest things she'd said to him. Mason held his mug and looked at her and said the thing he'd been not saying for about 3 weeks, which was the only honest answer available. I think I do, he said quietly. The winter evening held around them. He didn't say anything else, and neither did she, because some things need to be in the room for a while before they need to be said out loud, and they'd both been people who'd had things taken from them fast enough to know the value of going slow with things that mattered. 3 days. He looked back at the barn. 3 days, and then they'd know. The inspector arrived at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning in the last week of February, driving a gray county vehicle that he parked with the precise, unhurried placement of a man who was comfortable with his own authority and didn't need to demonstrate it through speed. His name was Gerald Holt. Mason had looked him up the previous evening, not because he wanted to, but because the previous evening had been one of those nights where the alternatives to looking something up were lying in bed staring at the ceiling, and at least looking things up produced information. Holt had been a licensed structural engineer for 26 years before moving to county inspection work 11 years ago. He had a reputation, in the professional circles Mason traveled in, for being thorough without being punitive. One contractor Mason called described him as, "He's not looking to fail you. He's looking to see if you did the work. If you did the work, you're fine." Mason had held on to that. The crew was there, Danny, Carl, Roy, because Mason had asked them to be, not because they were required to be. The job was done. Their presence on inspection day was not contractual. They came anyway, which told you something about what the job had become for them over the past 4 weeks, though none of them would have described it in those terms. Victoria was not in the barn when Holt arrived. She had told Mason the night before, sitting in the kitchen with the documentation package between them, that she was not going to watch the inspection. Mason had looked at her, and she had looked back at him with the clear-eyed self-knowledge of someone who understands their own limits without drama. "I'll be in the kitchen," she said. "I'll have my phone. You call me when it's done." "It might take a few hours." "I know." She'd looked at the barn, just briefly, through the kitchen window. "I've been waiting on this barn for 6 years, Mason. I can wait a few more hours." He'd understood. Some things you could watch, and some things watching made worse. She'd put everything into the last 30 days. Her money, her labor, her sleep, the version of hope she'd allowed herself to rebuild after years of letting it go. And if the verdict came back wrong while she was standing there, she'd have to manage her reaction in a room full of people, including the inspector and her contractor and a crew she'd come to care about. That was a kind of exposure she'd decided she didn't owe the moment. So she was in the kitchen, and Mason stood at the barn entrance and shook Gerald Holt's hand and said, "Thank you for coming. I'll give you the full walkthrough and answer whatever you need." And they went inside. Bots. Holt worked the way good inspectors worked, which was without much talking. He moved through the barn from south to north, which was the direction that built toward the critical work rather than opening with it. He had a clipboard with the county inspection form and a laser measure and a flashlight and his own set of eyes, which were the most important tool he carried. Mason walked with him, slightly behind, available but not hovering. The south section passed without comment, which meant it passed. Holt checked the concrete floor, the structural columns, the connection between the south section's timber frame and the original stone foundation. He made notes. He moved on. The stall partitions in the north end got longer attention. Holt ran his hand along the rebuilt partition walls, checking the connection between new lumber and the original post framing. He crouched at the base of 2 stalls and looked at the foundation repointing. He pressed his palm flat against one of the stall walls and held it there for a moment, feeling for flex. Roy, standing near the south partition, watched this with his arms folded and the expression of someone waiting to find out if a thing they built holds up to examination. Mason could see, from across the barn, the way Roy's jaw was set. Not tense, exactly. Present. The way a craftsman watches someone evaluate their work, with the particular combination of confidence and vulnerability that good work always carries. Because if it fails of the assessment, the failure belongs to both the work and the person who made it. The partition held. Holt moved on. He spent the longest time at the northeast corner. This was expected. It was the most complex section of the restoration, the place where the most had gone wrong and the most had been done about it. And an inspector of Holt's experience would know from the documentation package that this was where the story of the repair lived. He looked at the rafters from below. He looked at the through-bolt installations on connections 1 through 6, moving a small ladder that the crew had left staged exactly for this purpose. He looked at the ridge. He looked at the wall plate intersection and crouched at the foundation to examine the interface that Roy had jacked back to bearing on day 17. He was at the foundation interface for a long time, long enough that Danny, who was standing near the staging equipment, shifted his weight twice. Holt stood up. He looked at the north wall from a distance. He made a note on his clipboard. He looked up at the rafters one more time. "The jacking documentation," he said. "You included a repair narrative for the Connection 3 load event on day 20. "Yes," Mason said. "Walk me through it." Mason walked him through it. Precise, complete, not minimizing and not dramatizing. The load redistribution, the evidence of stress at Connection 3, the emergency exterior brace repair, the crew response, the subsequent inspection of the connection under load, the decision to document rather than omit. He spoke for about 4 minutes. Holt listened without interrupting and took notes. "Connection 3 was the one with the bad sister repair from the previous contractor," Holt said when Mason finished. "Yes. Your documentation shows you did a full replacement, pulled the old sister, installed new stock, through-bolted." "That's correct. Corso's written assessment includes the pre- and post-repair load calculations." Holt flipped to that section of the documentation package, which he'd been carrying under his clipboard. He read it, not quickly. His face was professionally neutral in the way that experienced inspectors were professionally neutral. Not cold, just controlled, because showing your hand during the assessment creates problems in both directions. "Your rigging specialist is licensed in this county?" he said. "Yes, I can pull the license number if you need it. I have it from the documentation." Holt looked at Connection 3 through the ladder. This is the correct repair approach for this condition. Full replacement rather than patch, he paused. A lot of contractors would have patched it. I know, Mason said. Holt came back down the ladder. He spent another 15 minutes on the north roof section, examining the new sheathing, the flashing, the ridge cap. He went outside and walked the north face exterior, looking at the new siding, running his hand along the board and batten pattern, checking the corners and the foundation interface from the outside. Mason stood inside and waited because there was nothing useful he could do outside that Holt wasn't already doing, and the space to do his job without audience was a professional courtesy. Carl appeared beside Mason. He said nothing. He just stood there, which was Carl's version of company. How do you think it's going? Danny said from the other side. I don't know yet, Mason said. Roy thinks it's fine. Roy hasn't said anything. Roy's nodding slightly to himself over there. For Roy, that's a standing ovation. Mason looked at Roy, who was indeed doing a small, slow nod that appeared to be aimed at nothing in particular, which meant it was aimed at his own internal assessment. Holt came back inside. He stood in the center of the north section and looked at it one final time. The comprehensive look, the kind where you're not checking one thing specifically, but reading the whole. Mason had done the same look himself on day 27, standing in this room after the crew had left, trying to see what a fresh eye would see. Holt wrote on his clipboard for a moment. Then he looked up. Mr. Reed, he said, this is a thorough restoration on a significantly compromised structure within a timeline that most contractors would have declined to accept. He paused. The documentation is complete and technically accurate. The repairs meet or exceed the county historic structure maintenance code requirements on every point I've examined. Another pause. The disclosure of the Connection 3 load event and the transparency of the repair narrative are consistent with the kind of professional practice I want to see in this county. The barn was very quiet. The structure passes inspection, Holt said. The barn held that sentence for a moment. It was not a dramatic sentence. It was 7 words in a flat declarative register delivered by a county inspector who had made this call hundreds of times and who would make it again next week and the week after. It was the most important sentence Mason had heard in 30 days. Danny made a sound. Roy's slow nod completed itself and stopped. Carl looked at the north wall with an expression that was as close to satisfaction as Carl's face typically permitted. Mason looked at the rafter connections above him. The 6 repaired points, the bolts he and Corso had set with cold hands in 19-degree weather, and he thought about a gap in a foundation that a child had pointed at, and a wall that had been crushed from above instead of from below, and a foundation that had never been the problem. Thank you, Mason said to Holt. I appreciate the thoroughness. Holt shook his hand. Good work, he said simply, and began gathering his materials. Mason stepped outside and called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear in the way she said yes that she'd been sitting near the phone, not waiting desperately. Victoria didn't do desperate, but present in the way you're present when the next thing that happens matters completely. It passed, Mason said. Silence. A specific quality of silence, the kind that has a lot of things in it that aren't ready to be words yet. Victoria, I heard you, she said. Her voice was steady. It was doing the thing it did when she was holding something larger than the voice wanted to contain. I heard you. The foreclosure threat is removed. The inspection is on record. The barn is certified. Another silence, shorter. Okay, she said, quietly. Okay. You should come out. Give me a minute, she said. He gave her a minute. He stood outside in the cold February morning with his phone in his hand and looked at the north face of the barn, the new siding, the repaired roof, the restored cupola they'd fixed on day 25 as a finishing detail that Roy had insisted on because the cupola was original to the 1887 structure and leaving it broken after restoring everything else would be, in Roy's words, like fixing a man's broken arm and leaving his collar undone. The estate kitchen door opened. Victoria walked across the frozen ground with her coat pulled around her and her eyes very bright, which was different from her usual appearance in a way that was small and significant at once. She walked to where Mason was standing and she looked at the barn. She looked at it for a long time. He let her. My father would have, she started and then stopped because that sentence was too big for the morning and she knew it. She took a breath. He would have liked you, she said instead. He respected people who did things right. From what I've heard about him, Mason said, I think I would have liked him back. She looked at him then. The morning light was in her eyes, which were dark and steady, and the controlled minimum she usually maintained was not especially present right now. She had allowed the moment to touch her, which was not something she did easily or often, and it was visible and she wasn't trying to hide it. Thank you, she said, for all of it. For not giving up when you had every professional reason to tell me it was too far gone. My daughter pointed at the foundation, Mason said. You looked at what she was pointing at. He looked at her. Yeah, he said. I did. The crew was coming out of the barn now, so Danny first, then Carl, then Roy, and the moment changed its shape around them, became something shared instead of private. Danny said something that was loud and celebratory and characteristically Danny. Carl shook Mason's hand with the firm, quiet grip of a man who doesn't need to say much when the handshake says it. Roy looked at Victoria and said, It's a good barn, Miss Whitmore, in the tone of someone making an official pronouncement, and she laughed, a real one, not the controlled version, and said, It really is. Gene Birch's truck came up the drive at 9, which turned out not to be a coincidence. He'd apparently called Dale Archer the previous evening asking when the inspection was, and Dale had told him. He climbed out with a thermos and a look on his face that was neither surprised nor particularly emotional, just satisfied. The look of someone who came to a conclusion weeks ago and is now watching the facts catch up to it. By 10 o'clock, there were 4 extra vehicles on the estate grounds. Word had traveled the way it traveled in a valley like Blackwood Ridge, not through any announcement, but through the particular rural social network that functions on cell phones and front porch conversations, and the organic propagation of information between people who knew each other's business because their businesses were adjacent and their lives were adjacent, and they'd been navigating the same geography together for long enough that they paid attention to each other. Walt came. Agnes came, with her daughter, who was 12 and looked at the restored barn with the wide attention of someone seeing something she'd already decided was worth looking at. The Dunn brothers showed up with a bottle of cider that had been in one of their trucks for reasons neither of them were clear about. Victoria moved through all of it with the particular grace of someone who had spent weeks in a shell and was not entirely sure what to do with the open air. She shook hands, she talked, she listened, she thanked people in the precise, genuine way she thanked people, without performance, and every person she thanked looked like they believed it, which meant it was real. Mason stood back and watched it. He was not by nature a man who stood back at things. His tendency was to be in the middle of them, managing, directing, ensuring the outcome. But this particular moment didn't need managing. It was doing what it was doing on its own terms, and his job in it was to let it happen. He thought about what Roy had said about the Callaway stable 3 weeks ago. The barn doesn't care about your deadline. You just do the work right, and the work takes the time it takes. He thought at the time that it was accurate without being comforting. He understood now that it was both. The crew packed out on a Wednesday. Equipment loaded, tools accounted for, the job site left in the condition Mason required every job site to be left in, which was to say, cleaner than they'd found it, because leaving a mess at the end of a job was a statement about how much you cared about the place you'd been working in, and he cared. Roy was the last one to leave. He stood at the south entrance for a moment before getting in his truck, looking back at the barn the way Mason had looked at it the night before the inspection, the comprehensive look, the full sweep. Then he turned and looked at Mason. This one was different, Roy said. Yeah. Usually when a job's this hard, you're just glad it's over. He looked back at the barn. I'm not entirely glad this one's over. Mason said nothing to that, because there was nothing to add. Roy got in his truck and drove away, and Mason stood in the empty site and did his own version of the comprehensive look. And then he got in his truck and drove home. Spring came to Blackwood Ridge the way spring comes to places that have earned it through difficult winters. Not gracefully, not all at once, but in increments that felt significant after the months of cold. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then from the fields, then from the north-facing shadows that held it longest. The ground came back muddy and then solid, and then, eventually, green. Mason drove out to the estate the first Saturday in April. He told himself it was a professional follow-up visit. Standard practice after a restoration of this scope, a 6-week post-completion inspection to verify that the structure was performing as expected through the freeze-thaw cycle of late winter into spring. This was true, and also not the whole truth, and he'd been honest enough with himself by this point to acknowledge the gap between those two things without making a larger issue of it than it needed to be. Emma was with him. She had asked to come in the tone she used when she'd already decided she was coming and was going through the courtesy of asking. Mason had said yes before she finished asking. She sat in the passenger seat with Captain on her lap and watched the valley come through the truck windows with the absorbed attention of a kid who hadn't stopped thinking about a place since the last time she'd been there. She'd asked, at some point in the preceding weeks, whether Ms. Whitmore was going to get the horses back. Mason had said he didn't know. She'd said she hoped so. She'd said she thought the barn was ready for them. He'd thought about the foundation gap that was no longer there, the load paths running clean and true through old timber, and said that yes, he thought the barn was ready. The estate in April was a different world from the estate in February. The formal grounds showed themselves properly now. The stone walls, the hedgerow lines, the wide gravel drive free of ice and salt damage. The trees had begun their tentative early budding, the kind that looks fragile and isn't, that has survived winters as hard as this one 100 times before. The pasture to the west of the barn, the field Mason had noticed on his first visit but had never had reason to cross, was not empty. 3 horses were in it. Emma pressed her face to the window. "Daddy?" she breathed in the voice she used for things that mattered completely to her. "I see them," he said. He parked and they got out, and Emma stood with her hand shielding her eyes, even though the morning sun wasn't especially bright, looking at the horses with an expression that was pure and uncomplicated in the way that 8-year-olds could still sometimes be, entirely in the moment, not managing it, not saving anything for later. Victoria came around the south side of the barn. She was wearing her work coat and the salt-stained boots, and she had a lead rope looped over one shoulder, which meant she'd been with the horses before they'd arrived. She stopped when she saw them, and something in her face did the thing that Mason had been filing in a specific location in his memory since February. "You came," she said. "Post-completion inspection," Mason said. "Of course," she said, and the small, quiet irony in it was directed at both of them equally. Emma was already walking toward the fence at the pasture edge, calling softly to the nearest horse. A bay with a white blaze who had turned at the sound of the car and was now regarding Emma with the particular cautious curiosity of a horse, deciding whether a small human was trustworthy. "When did they arrive?" Mason asked. "Last week. I reached out to the partner farm in March. The debt restructuring closed well enough to bring the first 3 back." She looked at the pasture. Phase 2 scope starts in June. The arena conversion. She paused. "I hired a contractor." He looked at her. "Different contractor," she said, and there was something careful and deliberate in how she said it, because she was a person who said things deliberately. "I thought there might be a conflict of interest with the original one." He held that for a moment. "What kind of conflict of interest?" She looked at him directly, which was the only way she ever looked at anything. "The personal kind," she said quietly. The morning was warm enough to have left its coat in the car, or at least to feel that the coat was unnecessary, and the horses were in the pasture, and Emma was at the fence making a sound that was apparently working because the bay horse had walked 2 steps closer and stretched its neck toward her hand. Mason thought about the drive up here 30 days ago in the ice, the barn in the gray morning, a woman with a crowbar, his daughter's cold hand in his, the gap at the foundation that nobody had seen because everyone was looking for the obvious failure instead of the actual one. He thought about what he'd said in the kitchen on day 27. "I think it's happening to me right now, actually." How he'd been looking at the wall when he said it, because he'd been looking at the wall instead of at her, because looking at her when he said it would have been saying something he wasn't ready to say. He was ready now. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you asked. Whether wanting something because someone you loved wanted it is the same as really wanting it yourself." She waited. "I think the answer is that it starts as one thing and becomes another," he said. "And by the time it's become the other, the origin doesn't really matter anymore. What matters is what it is now." He looked at her, which is what I'm trying to say about... He paused, because he was not, historically, good at the direct statement, when the direct statement was about something that mattered to him personally. He'd built a professional life on directness, and a personal life on careful avoidance of it, and the gap between those two things had been wide enough that most people who knew him professionally would have been surprised to know it existed. Victoria waited with the patience of someone who understood that the person in front of her was getting there and just needed the time. "About you," he said, "and whatever this has been, whatever I want it to be." She was quiet for a moment. The bay horse at the fence had accepted Emma's hand and was allowing itself to be stroked, very slowly, along the nose. "I've been spending time with a question," Victoria said. "Whether I'm capable of trusting someone new after—" She paused. "After everything. After losing my father, and the debt, and the years of carrying it alone." She looked at the barn. "I think I was afraid that the answer was no, that too much had happened and I'd become someone who couldn't do it anymore." "And?" Mason said. She turned and looked at him with the open expression, the real one, the one that didn't manage itself. "And I think I was wrong about that," she said. "I think 30 days of watching someone do exactly what they said they'd do, exactly the way they said they'd do it, and tell the truth even when it would have been easier not to—" She stopped. "I think that changes the answer." He looked at her. He thought about the first morning and her standing in the barn before he arrived, in the dark, with a crowbar. He thought about her on the scaffolding side in the ice storm. He thought about her in the kitchen after the jacking, at the table with the drawings, the warm room, and the winter outside. He thought about 30 days of watching someone work without performing, grieve without dramatizing, hope without pretending they weren't afraid of it. He thought about Emma saying, "I liked her" from behind her purple hat in the dark cab of the truck driving home on the first day, before any of this had happened. His daughter had seen it first. She usually did. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not complicated," he said. "I've got a kid and a dog with an identity crisis, and a truck that needs new rear tires, and a job that keeps me at cold construction sites in the winter." "I know," she said. "That's not a deterrent?" "Mason," she said, with the quiet patience of someone addressing the specific brand of self-protection that presents itself as full disclosure. "I've been awake since 4:30 this morning. I've been woken up at 4:30 every morning for 3 years. I just got 3 horses back from a farm 40 miles away because I'm trying to finish something my father died before he could finish. I have a property manager who has the quiet desperation of a man who's been managing a crisis for so long he's forgotten what not crisis looks like." She held his gaze. "I'm not exactly simple either." He looked at her. He looked at Emma, at the fence, at the horse that had trusted her, at the barn behind Victoria, solid and standing in the April morning, the new cedar shingles bright against the old board and batten, the repaired roofline running clean and true. "No," he said, "you're really not." She almost smiled. The full version came a second later, the one that changed her face, the one he'd been filing in a specific location. "So," she said. "So," he said. It was not a resolution of everything, and they both knew it. Complicated people doing complicated things in complicated circumstances didn't resolve cleanly, and neither of them was 22 years old waiting for the clean version. They were people who had lost things and rebuilt things and understood the difference between a structure that looked finished and a structure that actually held. They knew how to tell the difference. Emma turned from the fence and called back to them, holding Captain up toward the horse with the serious earnestness of someone making an important introduction. "She likes Captain," Emma announced. "She smelled him." "Captain is very likable," Victoria called back. Emma looked at them both, standing close in the April morning, not quite touching, with the expression of a child who has been assembling evidence for 6 weeks and has arrived at a conclusion she is choosing, for once, not to announce. She looked at them for a moment, then turned back to the horse. "Her name is going to be Compass," Emma said to the horse, as if the matter were settled, "because she knows where things are." Mason and Victoria stood in the morning and didn't say anything for a moment, and the valley ran green on every side of them, and the barn stood at their back like something proved. The Whitmore Riding Center opened in September, not with a ceremony. Victoria had argued against a ceremony, and Mason had agreed with her, because a ceremony would have required a version of the story that was tidier than the actual story, and neither of them was interested in the tidier version. Instead, it opened the way it was meant to operate, with horses in the pasture and children arriving on a Saturday morning for the first lesson group, 8 kids from Blackwood Ridge and 3 surrounding townships, ranging from 7 to 14. None of them from families that could have afforded the kind of private instruction that horse riding usually required in this part of the state. Emma was in the first group. She had been placed there by no particular decision-making process. She was the right age and she lived locally, which were the only criteria. The fact that she had been one of the first people to walk through the barn when it was still dying. The fact that she had crouched in the snow and pointed at a gap that changed the outcome. The fact that she had called the bay horse compass before the horse had a name. None of this appeared on any official document. It was just part of the story that the people who knew the story knew. Mason stood at the fence and watched. He was not good at watching. He was better at doing. But there were some things that needed to be watched instead of done, and this was one of them. Victoria came to stand beside him. "How many kids on the waiting list?" he asked. 22, she said. "We'll open a second lesson group in October." "And the finances?" She gave him a look that was dry and affectionate in equal measure. "The finances are stable. The debt restructuring closed. The Phase 2 scope came in on budget." She paused. "Barely." "Barely is fine," he said. "Barely is how most real things work." She was quiet a moment. "My father always said that too," she said. Not in those words. What were his words? He said, "You don't need a perfect start. You just need a real one." Mason looked at Emma in the ring. Serious-faced, upright in the saddle with the deliberate concentration of a kid who has decided to do something correctly and is doing it, and thought about driving 40 miles through ice with a sick kid in the passenger seat to tell a woman her barn was beyond saving. Thought about a foundation that wasn't dying. About load paths and bad repairs, and the difference between the problem you expected and the problem that was actually there. "Your father was right," he said. Victoria looked at Emma for a moment, then she looked at Mason. "She said something to me last week," she said, "when we were in the barn and I was showing her the new stall hardware." "What did she say?" She said. Victoria stopped for a second, and when she spoke again, her voice had the quality it had when something had gotten past her defenses before she could decide whether to let it. She said, "I'm glad we came back." A pause. And then she said, "My mom would have liked it here." Just like that. Very matter of fact. Another pause. I didn't know what to say. Mason was quiet. I said, "I think she would have too," Victoria said. "I hope that was right." "It was right," he said. He looked at the ring, at Emma and Compass moving together in the slow, steady circle of an early lesson, finding the rhythm between rider and horse that had to be discovered rather than taught. He looked at the barn beyond, the repaired roofline, the restored cupola, the new cedar bright in the September morning. He thought about what the 30 days had cost, and what they'd produced, and whether the accounting made sense. It did. The way most things did when you got far enough from them to see the full shape. Not the cost versus the return, not the difficulty versus the result, but the full picture of what it was. He thought about the night before the inspection, lying awake going through the documentation in his head, about Emma's fever and Tank's rope toy, and the rear tires he'd finally gotten replaced in March, about ice on a scaffolding in a February windstorm and coffee on a frozen morning before dawn, about the sound old timber makes when it comes back to bearing, about a woman who had been awake since 4:30 every morning for 3 years and was, as of 3 weeks ago, sleeping until 5:45, 45 extra minutes. It was not nothing. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Yeah." "That first morning, when you were going to tell me it was too far gone." She looked at him. "What changed your mind? Was it the gap Emma showed you? Or was it something else?" He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things. The gap was real, and it had changed the technical assessment. But the technical assessment was not all that had changed. "Both," he said. "The gap was the engineering, but the other thing," he paused. "You were in the barn before I got there. Before it was even light. By yourself, with a crowbar, trying to figure out how to fix it." He looked at her. "I don't know. Something about that." She looked at him. "I don't give up on things," she said. "No," he said. "You really don't." He reached over and took her hand, which was not a dramatic gesture and was not performed for anyone watching and was not accompanied by anything that needed to be said out loud. She let him, and her hand was warm and her grip was steady. The same grip she'd offered the first morning in the snow-covered field when they were strangers, and the barn was dying and 30 days was an impossible distance. It was no longer an impossible distance. Emma made a sound from the ring, not a word, just the sound a kid makes when a horse does exactly what they asked it to do for the first time, that involuntary short breath of pure surprise and delight. Mason and Victoria both looked. Compass had moved into a trot, and Emma was sitting it, not perfectly. She was bouncing slightly, working to find the rhythm, but staying with it, adjusting, not giving up, just doing the work. The September morning held around them. The valley was green and wide. The barn stood on its old foundation, load paths clean, every connection true, everything holding exactly as it was supposed to hold. Some things looked broken and were only waiting for someone to look at them correctly. Some people looked finished and were only waiting for something real to start. And some foundations, the ones you were certain had failed, the ones you'd driven 40 miles in the ice to finally declare beyond saving, turned out to be the strongest part of the whole structure, if you were willing to lift the weight that had been crushing them and give them a chance to do what they were built to do. The work takes the time it takes, and when it's done right, it holds.